"Shut your mouth, you ragged old black woman has no right to stand here," the police officer shouted in the middle of the street, as if dignity could be torn away by a uniform. He didn't know he had just screamed at the wrong person. He thought she would be scared, would cry, would beg for mercy. But unexpectedly, a single sentence from her left him speechless in front of the crowd live streaming the scene. No shouting, no lawyers. She made the entire system look at itself. When honor is stripped bare, what's left for the law to wear? Will you stay silent? What state do you live in? Under the late afternoon sun, the park near the corner of 14th Street was almost deserted. Wind drifted through the bare winter trees, leaving only the dry rustle of dead leaves and a few lost birdsong. The old stone bench, now mossy green, had a backrest worn down by the years, like the imprint of tired spines that had once leaned there. On that bench sat old Marlene Ellis, upright, her hands interlocked neatly on her. She wore a light gray wool coat, frayed at the cuffs but carefully washed and crisply pressed. Beside her sat a small burlap bag containing a bottle of medication, a book, and a black and white photo folded into thirds. In her ear, a tiny silver hearing aid still blinked. No one noticed her, and she needed no one to, until the heavy footsteps came pounding like war drums. Quick, forceful, impatient, a looming figure emerged from the main road. Police uniform, shiny chest buttons, a utility belt weighted with weapons. Officer Brent Delroy. He stopped 3 paces away, glanced around, and, seeing no one else, stepped forward again, as if distance too was a display of authority. No questions, no greeting. He pulled the baton from his belt, turned it sideways, and slammed it hard against the edge of the bench, less than a hand's breadth from her shoulder. The sound of splintering wood cracked like a hammer through a beating heart. "Who do you think you are, sitting here like you own the whole damn block?" Delroy's voice wasn't loud, but it pressed on every word. The question didn't wait for an answer. He stepped closer, hands on his hips, face lowered just inches from hers, eyes narrowed like floodlights locking onto a suspect. Marlene didn't flinch, didn't back away, didn't respond. She stared straight into him, an eerily calm gaze, but within it was the cold comprehension of someone who had witnessed this scene not less than 100 times, across generations, across the same face, the same cheap and aggressive display of power. Delroy frowned. He wasn't used to being stared back at, especially by someone black, old, fragile, and silent. "I'll say it again. This area doesn't allow anyone to sit for more than 10 minutes. You're in violation of Public Occupancy Code, Article 11. He grabbed his radio, pressed the button, and growled. "Dispatch, I need backup at the east side of the park. Possible suspect. Uncooperative. Elderly. Black. Alone. Repeat. Uncooperative." His voice was flat, as if reading from a manual on how to neutralize a threat. Without waiting for a reply, Delroy leaned down and yanked the hearing aid from Marlene's left ear. A faint click sounded. The device hit the ground, cracked on the stone tiles, its battery door popping off. He bent to pick it up, then dropped it. Not by accident, but as punishment. From shoulder height, so the fall became an insult. Plastic shards scattered, lying beside her bag. "Can't hear, or pretending to, so you can dodge inspection?" he sneered, like scolding a dog that refused to lie down. His eyes darted around, as if waiting for someone to witness this show of force, but the park remained still. Only a small sparrow darted by, then disappeared into the treetops. Marlene turned her face slightly, still staring at him. No anger, no pleading, no fear. Only the kind of silence the weak could never afford. The silence of someone who knew her worth and had no need to prove it. Delroy grew uneasy. The air felt heavier, like something tightening around his throat. He had slammed batons on car doors of drivers who refused to shut off their engines, shoved a young black man for wearing a backward cap in a restricted zone, grabbed the collar of an immigrant woman for walking beyond the sidewalk, but never had anyone simply not reacted, and still made him feel like he was being scrutinized. He stepped back half a pace, then, remembering his role, barked louder, his tone now more political than lawful. This area is under heightened security. Sitting here without clear cause can be flagged as suspicious behavior, you hear? Or are you one of those transients? You got any ID? His voice now snarled, as if her composure was a slap to his existence. Still no response, only wind brushing the trees, and eyes that seemed to pierce through to his core. He bent down and opened her bag without consent, and rifled through it. A book, medicine, an old photo, a neatly folded handkerchief. Delroy smirked as he held up the photo, then squinted. A young black woman stood beside a man in uniform. The image was faded, but the man's face, something about it made him stop. "What do you think this is, huh? Sitting here like a memorial waiting for tribute?" he mocked, tossing the photo back in the bag, then lightly kicking the corner of the bench, as if to assert he was still in control. One hand went to his radio again. He growled once more, requesting transport, suspect uncooperative, possible mental health issue, need evaluation at precinct. Still, Marlene did not respond. But as he turned away, she slowly raised her hand, picked up the broken hearing aid, and dusted it off with the edge of her coat, not in haste, not in anger, just the movement of someone who had lived longer than insults and knew that every wound could heal except the wound to dignity of the one who inflicted it. Delroy froze. There was something about the way she cleaned the device that made his skin crawl, a familiar image, as if he had seen someone do that before. Another woman, also old, also thin, also humiliated, also silent. He shook his head. Impossible. Not now. He cursed under his breath, turned away, hand gripping the baton like he was trying to hold together something already cracking. The park stayed quiet, but it was no longer innocent quiet. It was the kind of silence that lingers after a blow to someone's dignity before the echo returns. Delroy didn't know it yet, but he had just triggered an earthquake, and the old woman sitting there without a microphone, without power, had just left the first slash mark across his name in the file of fate. But that first slash mark required no ink, no sound. It was written in the unwavering stillness of her eyes and the unconscious fumbling of Delroy's hand as he clutched the baton, like trying to regain balance for a power that had just begun to crack. The wind shifted. A dry leaf brushed against his sleeve before drifting on, like a gentle reminder that time always sides with the silent who have reason. He jerked his arm away as if stung by a bee, then, without a word, bent down and grabbed Marlene's burlap bag like seizing contraband. No warning, no verbal command to search. He didn't ask, nor did he need to hear. His action was the declaration that his presence alone was the law. The bag was small, old, its fabric straps frayed into threads. The zipper squeaked slightly when yanked open. Without hesitation, Delroy flipped the entire bag upside down onto the cement, like issuing a verdict. The clinking of falling items was soft, but each one sounded deeper than a routine search. An amber glass pill bottle rolled once, then shattered against the bench leg. A few small coins scattered on the ground. A thin book with a torn spine, an old handkerchief, and a worn brown wallet. All spilled out as though someone had just overturned a part of memory without realizing they were tearing something sacred. He stomped his boot directly onto the wallet without so much as a glance, as if nothing coming from a black person's bag could possibly be worth preserving. Marlene bent down. Not hurriedly, not clumsily, she reached out to pick up each item, starting with the book, then the handkerchief, then the coins. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the cold, or perhaps from blood rushing back to her heart after the sudden jolt. As she reached for the wallet, the tip of her fingers brushing its edge, Delroy lifted his boot and kicked it away like flinging a worthless object in a concentration camp. "Easy now. Everything you have will be thoroughly inspected," he said, voice cold as stone, then smirked mockingly. "Fascinating. Beggars these days sure know how to perform, huh? Carrying heart meds, a wallet, books, like you actually live a real life." She didn't respond. She walked over to pick up the wallet, and as she bent down, the hem of her coat lifted just enough to reveal something no camera in the world could replicate. A pair of black shoes, so worn the toes were nearly torn through, leaving only a thin lining. The edges had been stitched by hand, tiny, neat, even stitches, like the handwriting in a grade school ethics notebook. The shoes had no logo, no brand, no trace of marketable value. But they were clean. They were cared for. They looked like something held together by someone still trying to live with decency in a world where no path remained to walk. A child nearby, perhaps 8 years old, stood holding a phone beside her mother, quietly recording everything from afar. She whispered, her voice tiny but clear enough, "Mom, why is that man yelling at the lady?" The mother flinched. She pulled her child's arm down and hushed. "Don't get involved in police matters." The child still stared, her eyes wide, not afraid, just bewildered. She didn't yet know the law, but she knew something was wrong. Delroy paid no attention to the mother and daughter. He was too busy continuing his performance. Not for anyone else, but likely for the distorted self-hemo he mistook for authority. He bent down and picked up the shattered medicine bottle, read the label, heart 75 milligrams, patient name Marlene H. Ellis. He squinted, then hurled it into a nearby trash bin, as if tossing out something expired. No apology, not even a backward glance. Marlene gathered what was left, placing each item back into the bag, like a woman picking up pieces of her dignity after a storm. Every coin, every scrap of paper, every trace of a life now being examined through the lens of suspicion. Her hand trembled slightly as it grazed the spot where the pill bottle had once been, but she didn't groan, didn't cry, didn't beg. She simply gripped the handle of the bag, stood up, and the worn soles of her shoes made a soft scraping sound like sandpaper against concrete. Delroy scanned her from head to toe, like assessing a piece of seized property. He chuckled coldly. "You should be grateful. People like you usually don't get noticed. I gave you the privilege of attention." His voice carried a shade of arrogance, a hint of condescension, and the filth of someone long practiced in trampling others as second nature. Marlene still said nothing, but this time she raised her head. Her gaze was no longer a question, no longer a calmness. It was the first incision into a system that thought itself untouchable. A crack, small, but it would spread in silence, in that stare, and in the memory of that child who would grow up and one day recount to a whole generation that there was once an old lady whose bag was ransacked, whose wallet was kicked, who was berated and robbed of her last pill, but still stood tall, wearing a pair of hand-stitched shoes with worn-out soles. Delroy adjusted his belt, jerked his chin as a signal for her to follow him to the station, like leading an unlicensed animal back to its cage. She didn't move right away. She looked straight into his face, eyes devoid of anger, but made his collar suddenly itch, not from dust or fabric, but because something inside him was rebelling, a part of memory, a part of shame still unnamed. And in that moment, as she turned to walk away, something broke. Not the pill bottle, not the wallet, but the image he once believed was strength. Along the path leading out of the park, sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a narrow beam across her back. Not large, not towering, but unmistakable, like a line drawn between right and wrong. She had no need to say a word, because those worn-out shoes had already spoken, and the sound of a kicked wallet today will echo inside the conscience of those who thought themselves the law, but forgot that some things need no statute to deserve respect. Dignity, preservation, and the upright posture of one who refuses to kneel, even when the world commands it. A middle-aged man in a tracksuit approached, holding a half-finished Starbucks cup, eyes gleaming with anticipation like he was about to witness a street boxing match. Behind him trailed a group of young men in hoodies, phones already switched to live stream mode, faces so thrilled they didn't even bother to feign concern. One of them shouted mockingly at Delroy, "Go harder! Old ladies only understand the law when they're face down on the ground." Dry laughter exploded from the back. It was like someone had dropped a laugh grenade into the middle of a crackdown, and the onlookers didn't want to miss the chance to become active participants in this cheap piece of entertainment. A child ran past, tripping over Marlene's worn-out wallet, then kicking it aside like stepping on a piece of old chewing gum. The mother yelled for her child, not because what happened was wrong, but out of fear of becoming involved. The eyes around didn't look at Marlene with empathy. They pried, delighted, and some were simply indifferent. They weren't on anyone's side, just on the side of drama. And if blood were to spill, they would slow the footage down to see it better. An elderly man in a faded suit with silver hair stepped halfway forward, eyes squinting like he was wrestling with his conscience. His hand had already reached out, about to touch Delroy's shoulder or say something to de-escalate the situation. But before he could speak, the friend beside him gripped his arm tightly, pulling him back as if dragging someone off a railroad track. "Don't. You trying to get yourself killed?" The whisper was sharp enough to send chills. The old man didn't respond, but his eyes were flooded with shame, as though he had just betrayed something greater than himself. A tall young man, wearing a backward snapback cap, stepped forward, phone in one hand, the other raised in front of his chest as a gesture of peace. "Hey man, this lady didn't do anything. Do you really have to?" He didn't finish. Delroy spun around, eyes wide like a provoked beast. "You want to get cuffed? Obstructing law enforcement, punk." His voice was icy, each word carved out, and his eyes didn't look at the young man like a person, but like a nuisance to be removed. The young man froze, glanced around, then stepped back, not because he feared being arrested, but because he knew if things fell apart, no one would stand up for him, and the silence closing in started to take shape, the shape of cowardice. From the far end of the park, a shrill voice rang out, mocking all the swelling silence. "Old black folks always causing trouble," followed by another burst of laughter. They didn't laugh because it was funny. They laughed because they feared silence, feared being the only one not joining in on this spreading humiliation. In that kind of air, morality doesn't die from being trampled. It dies from no one trying to preserve a single scratch. Marlene looked at no one, reacted to no one. She knelt down, hands trembling as she picked up each piece of paper, each coin, each tiny thing that seemed worthless now. Her thin fingers shook, perhaps from the cold or from blood being blocked too long, but each movement carried the resolve of someone far too used to picking up her dignity after it had been thrown to the ground. When her hand touched a piece of paper swept aside by the wind, it unfolded, a photograph, blurred, faded, old, but the evening light cut across it just right, revealing the image clearly, a young black woman, standing on a stage, holding an honorary diploma. Behind her, the American flag and the crest of a prestigious university. No one noticed the photo. No one saw, except her and a child, watching silently through a phone camera. Delroy stepped forward, watching her gather the scraps like a shameless scavenger. He laughed, a hollow, crooked laugh, like someone who just struck the weak and still didn't feel satisfied. "Well, look at this. Perfect setup. Wallet, pills, golden days photo, tears. It's like you're filming a biopic about yourself. Maybe I should play the villain in your movie." He spat on the ground, landing just an inch from her foot. The whole park went quiet. No more laughter. No one stepped up. They stood there, filming, breathing, waiting, but no one spoke. Because the truth was, no one there wanted to be the only one saying the right thing in a crowd that had already chosen the wrong side. A woman in business attire murmured to her friend, "If she'd have screamed, if she'd have fought back, I would say something." But Marlene didn't scream, and the woman said nothing. Marlene stood up, deliberate. The photo now folded and slipped into her coat pocket. She gently brushed the dust off her trousers, a motion slow and meticulous, like a retired school teacher cleaning the chalkboard before leaving the classroom. No words, no pleading glances, no expressions trying to pull others to her side. She wasn't looking for allies. She stood alone. And that was what made the crowd's silence more terrifying than the assault itself. Because if she had screamed, they could have justified not joining the argument. But she didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't cry. She simply existed. And a person who dares to exist with dignity while injustice runs wild becomes a mirror reflecting the rot of those who stand aside. A little girl behind a stone statue suddenly asked her mother in a soft voice, "Mom, did that lady do something wrong?" The mother hesitated. She looked at her daughter, then at Marlene, then at Delroy, then at the crowd, then back at herself, and said nothing. The question fell into the void. No answer. No one brave enough to speak, because to answer that question, one must first answer a bigger one. Who am I in that moment? A man with a professional video camera crouched behind a tree, lens fixed on Marlene, eyes unmoving. He didn't press record, not because he didn't dare, but because he knew this moment didn't need to be captured. It had already etched itself into the minds of everyone present. Each person had recorded it through their own silence, and that very silence, strangely enough, had turned Marlene from a victim into the protagonist of an indictment that needed no judge. Delroy adjusted his radio, buttoned his uniform, and jerked his chin. Disperse. Nothing to see here. His voice dry, cold, no trace of triumph left. The crowd began to shuffle away, none daring to meet Marlene's eyes, none daring to look at each other. They walked off, carrying with them a shame too heavy to name. The park returned to quiet, but it was no longer peaceful. It was aftermath, the residue of a battle no one dared to fight, no one dared to speak in, and one person, just one, walked through, without needing a single word of defense. Marlene stood there, silently, among the papers just collected, the gazes just turned away, and the backs of those who had chosen not to become witnesses. Because when the crowd doesn't stand for justice, they're no longer witnesses, they are accomplices. And she knew that, like someone who had seen history repeat itself through organized silence. No one stayed behind. No one bowed their head. No one dared to call her by name. But their eyes, even if just a glance, even if only for half a second before turning away, carried something none of them had the courage to face: shame. And as that crowd receded from the park like a guilty tide pulling back from the sand, Marlene remained standing, her hands loosely holding the straps of her bag, the old wallet already retrieved and tucked neatly at the bottom. Her shadow stretched long beneath the slanted sunlight, like the final stroke in a painting too honest for anyone to dare hang on their own wall. Delroy stepped forward, his eyes brushing past a recording phone, held by someone who didn't have the courage to intervene, but had just enough time to document another person's humiliation. Then he bent low, bringing his face within inches of Marlene's, close enough to share breath. "Look here," he growled, enunciating each word, then pulled the body camera from his chest, adjusted the lens, hit record, and barked as if declaring victory through deceit. "Right here. Your new face of elderly crime." The words weren't loud, but they rang clear as bronze bells at midday, cutting through the silence that had only just been stitched back together by the evening wind. His face was so close she could see the coarse stubble left behind from a rushed shave, the pulse in his neck twitching with performative rage, the beads of sweat glistening at his temples, not from heat, but from uncertainty. Even he didn't fully believe what he was doing anymore. Maybe it was just too late to turn back from a chain of wrongs he'd already set in motion. But Marlene didn't look at him, not out of contempt, not out of fear, but because she looked through him. Her gaze didn't stop at the sneering face trying to dramatize its authority. It cut through skin, through uniform, beyond the badge, beyond the baton, beyond the lens aimed squarely at her, and pierced straight into the one thing he would never dare examine, the core of morality that had long since rotted within himself. Her gaze, devoid of hatred or vengeance, carried a weight without sound. It was the gaze of a generation that once stood before real rifles, real fire hoses, that had stared death in the face for the right to be called human with a full breath. And in that gaze, Delroy was nothing more than a corrupted echo, a warped relic of a generation strayed far from the ideals their forebears had died trying to pass on. That gaze made Delroy hesitate, just for 1 second, but it was enough. Enough for his hand to ease off the record button, enough for his breath to stutter in his throat. He forced his mouth to move, that Look. Scared someone before? His voice was no longer firm, no longer a threat. It trembled, slightly, as if someone was asking himself a question. Through another man's lips, she did not answer, but her lips, dry from cold, from age, from decades of words swallowed back, curved faintly, a smile, not one of joy, but of disdain, a disdain that needed no sarcasm, no cursing, a disdain shaped by the strength of someone who had seen more than blood, who had seen the silence of the power shrink before the dignity of the weak. That smile, breaking through an air saturated with lies, made the space around them choke, not because it was loud, but because it was true, not because it was sharp, but because it was silent. Behind Delroy, a young officer stood watching. He hadn't drawn his weapon, hadn't spoken, but his eyes locked on to Marlene, not out of curiosity, but recognition. Something in her movement made him step back half a pace, as if realizing he was standing before a symbol no textbook had dared to name. He tilted his head slightly and whispered to the officer beside him, a voice not loud, but unmistakable. "She looks just like the woman in that painting at the Capitol hallway." The words sliced through the silence, not because of what they meant, but because they dared to exist. Delroy spun around, eyes flaring. "What did you say?" he growled. The young officer fell silent, didn't answer, but in his eyes a fire had been lit, and in that quiet resistance, small as it was, something finally refused to bow. Delroy turned back toward Marlene, as if one more command could erase everything, but her eyes were still there, unshaken, unbroken, uncontrolled. Her gaze didn't try to prove anything, but it made every thinking soul feel exposed. He stepped back, a few steps, not out of fear, but because he didn't know what to do next. No one had ever taught him what to do when a victim doesn't beg, doesn't resist, doesn't cry, but instead stands upright and looks him in the eye like holding a mirror up to an entire system. The camera on Delroy's chest kept recording, but film can't capture a gaze, can't store a smile, can't understand why an old, weak, poor woman didn't collapse, because that truth lies outside the reach of any device. It exists only where human conscience can reach. And that Delroy had lost long ago. When he turned to walk away, the sky had already darkened toward dusk. Her shadow stretched farther, like a red thread pulled backward from present to past. But her gaze still followed, not toward him, not toward the crowd, but toward something far more vast, a space filled with faces once broken, arms once shackled, dreams once gunned down, words once silenced, and now that gaze no longer belonged to the present. It was a mirror for those brave enough to see themselves clearly, and for men like Delroy, that mirror didn't reflect a face. It reflected an emptiness. When she turned to leave, no one dared approach, no one dared meet her eyes, because what had just happened wasn't a clash between a citizen and a cop. It was a courtroom without a judge, without lawyers, without closing arguments, where a single gaze, alone, rose up in place of every indictment, and the sentence was shame, still too raw to name. That gaze did not follow Delroy back to the station, but it haunted every step like an invisible spear. It did not pierce skin, did not draw blood, but left a thin tear across his pride, a tear he did not dare name. He returned to headquarters half irritated, half uncertain, the strange reaction of the young officer, the eerie silence of the old woman, the smile that did not belong to a victim, all of it created a strange aftershock, as if he had just struck not merely a black old lady, but a doorway into something far beyond his jurisdiction. He passed through the main entrance of the station, swiped his badge at the security gate like always, but this time his hand froze, requiring 3 passes before the scanner accepted it. Only then did the door unlock. In the records room, the fluorescent lights shone harshly across his slicked-back hair, casting a fake halo, like a scene from a film about a villain unaware he was nearing his own unraveling. He tossed Marlene's ID card onto the desk and barked to the technician behind the monitor. Run this name, urgent." The technician silently took the card and entered it into the system. The sound of keystrokes clicked like a countdown, each tap marking the seconds before the system would have to confront a piece of the past it once tried to bury. The screen blinked for a moment, then froze. A single line of blazing red text appeared, without explanation, without icon, without alert tone. Just one lone sentence, stark as a blade across a soulless data field. Classified, advisory access, level Omega. The technician frowned slightly. His hands paused mid-air. Delroy's brow tightened, his voice sharper. "What kind of error is that?" The technician didn't answer immediately, only tilted his head toward the adjacent desk, where an aging lieutenant sat reviewing the morning's crime logs. The man's back was slightly hunched, eyes nearsighted, an old silver watch on his wrist, chair back gently shifting with his breath. When the technician signaled with a glance, the lieutenant turned, and the moment he saw the red text on the screen, his face went pale. He didn't speak right away, just stood there frozen, one hand resting on the keyboard. Not typing, not moving. 1 second, 2, then 5. His hand trembled slightly, not from age. His lips parted faintly, but no words came out. Finally, he began repeating a phrase, almost whispering to himself, She's still alive?" The question wasn't loud, but it sank the entire room into stillness. The technician looked over at Delroy, visibly unsettled. Delroy slammed his palm on the table, impatient. "I'm asking you, who is this woman? Who the hell is she that the system's locked up like it's a damn spy movie?" The old lieutenant looked up at him. His eyes were not sharp, not angry, only filled with the astonishment of a man suddenly reconfronted by a memory he thought had long been buried. "That name," he said slowly, each word scraped up from the depths of memory, "is one of the 7 people who drafted the Federal Civil Rights Reconciliation Charter in 1974. Delroy raised his eyebrows, still not fully grasping. "You mean she used to work for?" The lieutenant shook his head. "Not worked for. She laid the foundation. She redefined what enforceable civil rights meant. She was invited by the White House to rewrite the definition of systemic silence after the Ferguson incident. She once declined a Nobel Peace Prize nomination because she said, 'Peace is not something to pin on a medal.'" The records room went silent. Not a single sound. No one laughed. No one scoffed. Only the steady rotation of the ceiling fan could be heard, and the red text, still blinking on the screen, unchanged. Delroy stepped back half a pace. He turned to the technician. "Print the file for me. All of it." The technician typed in the command. The printer in the corner hummed, its lights flashing on, then stopped. A message appeared on the secondary monitor. "Print lock biometric authorization required." Below it, a smaller line appeared, cold as a vault sealed by history. "Permanent lock. Biometric authorization. Verification only." Delroy frowned, not understanding immediately. "Biosignature? You mean like a fingerprint?" The lieutenant shook his head again, this time his voice dropping, wearied. "No, that only applies to special files under the Federal Character Protection Program. Biosignature means it's something only they can access. A form of identity recognition that doesn't allow anyone, not even the feds, to open the file without the person's direct consent." He stood there frozen. He, the man who had yanked the hearing aid from an old woman in a park. He, the man who kicked her wallet, stepped on her medication, recorded video as if he'd got a rare animal. He, the man who said, "Look here," the new face of elderly crime. And now, before him, was a file sealed at level Omega, the level reserved for those the system itself dared not touch. No one said another word. Delroy stood upright, face pale, eyes locked on the final line on the screen, a line he had never seen in 11 years as a police officer. Access denied, not because he lacked the rank, but because, at the core, he lacked the right to judge the woman he once thought was a senior delinquent. The truth began to leak not from the press, not from social media, but from the one place he never anticipated. A system he once believed to be his personal playground, now staring back at him, refusing to open. Marlene was not present, but everything she had ever done, ever signed, ever built, still existed, still protected her, like an invisible armor forged from law. from reason, from the legitimacy of history. And Delroy, in a late afternoon within the chill of a records room, finally understood there are people who do not need to speak a word, do not need to shout, yet still compel the entire system to take a step back by nothing more than a name he had been too foolish to underestimate. And now no one in the precinct dared repeat that name again, not out of fear of her, but out of fear they were unworthy to even say it. Delroy walked out of the records room with a face as stiff as a plaster statue cracked at the neck. The glass door closed behind him, but the echo of the words, "permanent locked bio-invalidation verification only," still rang in his head like a siren stretched through the dark. His footsteps felt heavier than usual. The collar began to tighten. That itch at the back of his neck, the unbearable sensation that comes when you realize you've touched something every survival instinct told you to avoid, was tightening around his nerves. Yet the ego of a police officer forced him to hold his head high, keep his shoulders squared, and walk as if nothing had happened, though every cell in his body was pounding alarm. He shoved open the door to his private office and slammed it shut behind him like a reflexive, defensive gesture. He unlocked his personal phone. His fingers flicked quickly through the contact list. The first name he picked was Lieutenant Colonel Huxley, the man who had directly commanded him in multiple arrest operations. Huxley was the type of person afraid of nothing except boredom, or so Delroy thought. He hit call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then a fourth, and finally a voice. "Hux here." Delroy didn't hesitate, gritting his words into the phone. "I just temporarily detained someone named Marlene H. Ellis. Something weird happened. Her file is encrypted under Omega classification, can't be printed." The on-site lieutenant went pale, said something about a civil rights charter. "Do you know who she is?" Silence on the other end. A pause lasting exactly 3 seconds, long enough for anxiety to rise to the surface like oil floating in old water. Then a sharp exhale, unfiltered in its unease. "What name did you just say?" Delroy repeated it. Slower now, as if spelling it out. "Marlene Ellis." Click. The call dropped. No dial tone, no apology, no signal error. Just a brutal end, like someone slamming shut a coffin before the dead can utter a final word. Delroy stared at his phone, stunned. He redialed. No answer. Tried again. This time, the line was out of coverage. A message appeared. "Sorry, the user is currently unavailable." In this context, it no longer sounded like a technical notification. It felt like a personal message. "Don't drag me into this." He tossed the phone on the desk, exhaled sharply, then stood and headed straight to the chief secretary's office. As the door opened, before he could step inside, the blonde secretary looked up, her eyes familiar but wary. "Delroy," she said quietly, without the usual social tone, "what have you gotten yourself into?" He tried to stay composed. "I just need confirmation. Is there something unusual about the name Marlene Ellis?" She didn't answer right away, just glanced around, then leaned toward him, lowering her voice. "If it's really that Marlene Ellis, you should probably write your resignation." Her tone didn't carry threat. It sounded like advice from someone who had seen others vanish from the system without so much as a personnel file left behind. A kind of disappearance only those who've brushed against forbidden names understand. A retreat from the machine, not through termination, but through oblivion. Delroy let out a brittle laugh, though it broke between clenched teeth. "Are you threatening me?" The secretary simply shook her head. "I'm warning you. Whether you listen or not is not my responsibility." He turned and walked out. "No, thank you." No further words. His eyes were bloodshot, like someone had just slapped his pride. But he still had one option left. Internal systems. He opened the internal communication software on his computer, typed the keyword Marlene Ellis. No public file, no photo, no birth date, only a thread of encrypted internal emails. One of them partially leaked. Subject, passive alert. Data related to subject Ellis. No access, no extraction. No inquiry without clearance. You urgent. The body of the message appeared like blood blooming across white. 3 federal officers have previously attempted to access the file of Marlene H. Ellis, without consent from high-level administrative authority. All three were immediately reassigned to Alaska. No appeal, no explanation. Delroy froze. He read it once, then again, then a third time. The words didn't change. Still Alaska. Still no appeal. He clenched his fists and tried to forward the message to his personal phone, but the system returned an error. Unable to send, content restricted from backup. The firewall didn't block him with code, it blocked him with power. No backdoor, no escape route. Panic began to seep into his spine like a needle through skin, but he still tried to stand tall. He adjusted his collar, straightened his tie. His stoic expression held its shape. He left his office, face blank, but inside his mind, dozens of defense scenarios were unspooling. I can deny it, say it was mistaken identity, shift the blame to records, argue that I was just following protocol, but all those strategies shared the same flaw. None could stand against a name etched into the foundation of the very system he served. Delroy suddenly realized something. Some names don't need rank, don't need power. They exist like a gravitational force of ethics, pulling all those who once relied on brute force, once mistook violence for justice, once believed themselves the balance, into staggering awareness that they have been standing on the wrong side. A junior officer walked by, file in hand, and halted upon seeing Delroy. His eyes flicked over, then quickly looked down as he passed. No words exchanged. But the silence wasn't avoidance anymore. It was recognition. When the system begins to look at you like a ticking bomb, no one wants to stand nearby. And Delroy understood. He had entered a forbidden zone. Not a place without exits, but a place where every door had already been closed. Before he realized he was locked inside the very power he once thought was his weapon. Only difference now, that weapon no longer pointed outward. It had turned and aimed straight at the man holding it. Delroy said nothing else. He sat back down in his office like a body unaware that it had already stopped breathing. Every sound from outside came in distorted, like echoes from a world he no longer had control over. A while later, the desk phone vibrated. No ringtone, no caller ID, just 3 sharp, even pulses. The kind of internal line reserved for special orders. He picked up. A woman's voice came through. No greeting, no introduction. "Are you holding someone named Marlene Ellis?" He exhaled. "Yes." The voice didn't shift tone. "Prepare to receive legal representation. The release order has been transferred to the station clerk. If you do not comply, you will be summoned for disciplinary review within 36 hours. The call ended, leaving no space for rebuttal. Delroy shot up, flung the door open, and stormed down the hallway like a cornered animal, still unwilling to admit defeat. His eyes scanned every face, but no one dared meet his gaze. Inside the duty room, a thick folder had been placed on the table, its cover stamped, "Federal authority, immediate execution required." Attached to it was a silver badge embossed with the seal of the Federal Civil Rights Council, an old emblem Delroy had only ever seen in history books, now glinting under the ceiling lights like a relic, reminding him of the names the system tried to bury but failed to erase. And then the door opened. No spectacle, no bodyguards, no high heels clacking on the white tile floor, just one person entered. A woman, petite, hair neatly tied back, carrying a briefcase and a gaze cold as a constitutional oath. She didn't state her name, she simply held the silver badge out in front of Delroy. No flourish, no movement closer, no need for him to verify its authenticity, because that badge needed no verification. Its existence alone was a declaration. Delroy furrowed his brow, trying to muster the tone he was used to wielding. "I haven't received confirmation that the subject has any protected status." The lawyer didn't blink, didn't smirk, didn't lower her voice. "You may not be confirmed, but you will be held accountable for why you failed to execute a federal council's release order. And when you answer for that, make sure the camera in the hearing room is rolling." Her voice was not loud, but each word sounded honed from steel, leaving no room for retreat. Delroy clenched his jaw. His eyes narrowed, no longer confident, only trying to avoid cracking in front of subordinates. He pushed the case file aside like a final gesture of disdain, but his hand involuntarily shifted half a step back. The lawyer paid him no more attention. She turned to a young officer nearby, the one who had been holding the investigation file moments earlier, and asked, "Who is overseeing the custody of Marlene Ellis?" The officer hesitated, swallowed dryly, then silently led her toward the holding room. Delroy did not follow. He stood frozen in the hallway, his eyes reddening like someone had dipped his hands into a wound of his own making. The holding room door opened, and in the soft amber light, Marlene sat calmly, not restrained, not defensive, not dazed, just seated upright, eyes fixed on the door as if she had known this moment would come. When the lawyer stepped in, Marlene asked nothing, needed no explanation, no confirmation. She simply nodded gently, then stood. Her steps were still slow, but slow in the way of someone deeply familiar with the pace of injustice and who knew how to walk through it without losing herself. As Marlene passed the young officer, she didn't look up, but her hand reached into her coat pocket, drew out a small, folded piece of paper, and handed it to him. He accepted it like a man receiving evidence, but upon unfolding it saw nothing but a handwritten line. "Don't let your mother see you bow to what's wrong." He stood still. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but because never before had a sentence struck so deeply into the part of a uniformed man that rarely gets touched. In the hallway outside, an internal affairs officer leaned against the wall, watching everything. He didn't step forward, didn't interfere, but as Delroy turned away, the man approached, leaned in just enough, and whispered only for him to hear. "You do know she used to be a special monitor for the Ferguson case, right?" Delroy said nothing. He didn't ask, because he understood asking would be to admit ignorance. Silence, at least, left him a shred of dignity, but his face had already gone ashen like cold ash, not out of fear of the woman, but fear of what he had done, not knowing who she was. He wasn't worried about being fired, wasn't worried about an investigation. He only feared that the name Delroy would now forever be recorded as a stain on the file of someone the entire system once bowed its head to. Marlene walked out of the station unaccompanied. No one escorted her. No one waved goodbye. No one dared to stop her. But with each step she took, every eye turned, not out of curiosity, but instinct. The kind of instinct that knows some people need no guns, no lawyers, not even weapons to make others feel they are standing on the wrong ground. And she was such a person. She made no proclamation. She simply appeared. The lawyer walked beside her, saying nothing, as one who understands she was not leading, but merely walking alongside a living page of history, crossing through an era it once helped shape. They passed through the main lobby, through the automatic glass doors. No one dared press the alarm. No one called a superior. No one did anything, because everyone understood this was not a release. This was a reckoning. And Delroy, still standing in the hallway, for the first time in 11 years of wearing a uniform, no longer felt that the badge on his chest represented the law. It was just a piece of metal, cold, mute, reflecting the image of a man who once thought he had the power to define right and wrong, without understanding that what is right does not reside in a badge. It resides in the eyes of someone who needs not argue, but still makes the entire system bow its head. The glass door of the precinct closed behind Marlene like a period for those still clinging to the illusion that power gets the final word. But to Delroy, it was no period. It was a parenthesis, opening into a sequence of questions he never imagined he would have to confront, and even less imagined he would be swallowed by. He stood silently in his office, one hand resting loosely on the edge of the desk, like someone who had just misstepped off a stair he thought was still there. No one entered, no one asked, no one called him into a meeting, into a press conference, or to defend his actions. Every door had closed, not by order, but by silence, a silence that required no consensus, no press release, only the right person walking past. And then, just as Delroy sat down, an old brown envelope appeared on his desk. No one delivered it, no one announced it. It was simply there, as if it had always belonged exactly where it had to be, waiting for the moment he was no longer able to reject it. There was no sender's name on the envelope. Only one single line written in faded violet ink, the handwriting slanted but firm. "You need to understand what you touch." He opened the envelope, not hurriedly, not eagerly, just like someone lifting the lid of a box they had already touched, too late to turn back. Inside was a stack of old documents, the paper yellowed with age, yet preserved with such care that each page seemed like a vein of time that must not be torn. The first page was a letter, handwritten, signed Malcolm X. Brief, precise, burning. "I never thought I'd bow to anyone, but that day, before her, I was silent, because there are people who don't need to chant slogans. They are the slogan." He skimmed quickly, as if afraid the ink on the page would snap something inside he once believed he represented. The second page was a black and white photograph of a group of people standing on a United Nations stage. In the center was a woman dressed in a dark, long-sleeve blouse. High collar, no makeup, no flashy smile, only a direct, cold, unshakable stare. The note on the back read, "Special Advisory Delegation on Community Justice, United Nations, Geneva, 1977. Delroy froze at the third page. It was no longer paper and ink. It was a color photograph, clear, vivid. The background was a state police headquarters hallway in the 1980s. At the center stood a woman, Marlene herself, younger, but her gaze unchanged. Beside her was a young man in a cadet uniform, holding a police cap without a badge, his face solemn as if about to enter a sacred oath. And that man, undeniably, was Delroy's father. Delroy gasped, lips pressed tight like someone had punched him in the gut. He flipped the photo over. On the back, the same slanted handwriting remained. The ink smeared in spots from time, but the message still sharp enough to cut straight through where pride used to live. Every generation has a destroyer and a keeper. He didn't let go, but the photo slipped from his hand, as if it refused to be held by the same hand that had once lowered a baton onto the shoulder of the person in it. The photo landed face down on the floor, the paper's surface catching the pale glare of the fluorescent light, no longer a keepsake, but a verdict. Delroy's hands trembled. No one saw, but he knew, and he could no longer deny it. The photo wasn't doctored, not a media stunt, not emotional manipulation. It was history, the very thing he thought had lain still, now returning to slap him in the face with the sting of truth. He tried to stand, to move toward the photo as if to retrieve it, but his legs would not obey. He wasn't afraid, he wasn't panicked, he just felt exposed, stripped. Not by Marlene, not by the system, but by his own father, the man he had once held as a role model, whose portrait hung in his office, whose name he invoked in speeches about honor and tradition in service. Every generation has a destroyer and a keeper. That line didn't name who was who, but Delroy didn't need to be told. He understood, and he had never read a sentence so simple that could make his spine go cold like stepping barefoot onto the season's first ice. He wanted to scream, wanted to throw the photo, wanted to grab his radio and shout that he had been tricked, but he did none of it. He just stood there, hand clenched, eyes locked on the photo, lips trembling, not from the cold, but because something in his bloodstream had just shifted direction, as if the honor once injected into his veins had just been silently withdrawn by an invisible needle. No one entered the room, but out in the hallway, the eyes had begun to change, no longer avoiding, no longer sneering, now quietly watching, by those who understood that a tremor had begun right at the heart of power, and no one could stop it. Delroy bent down. His hand touched the photo, but this time there wasn't enough strength left to lift it. Delroy remained bent over, his eyes fixed on the photograph, lying face down on the floor, like someone who had just received a verdict without needing a courtroom to declare it. He didn't pick it up. He couldn't, not because of fear, but because his hands those that had once yanked a woman's bag, stomped her wallet, dismissed a release order, no longer had the right to touch something he had once deemed meaningless. He looked up, exhaled sharply as if to shake off whatever was rising in his throat, then silently walked out into the hallway, his footsteps heavy as though carrying the voice of his father from a photo that had never been revealed until now. At that moment, an elderly man, around 70 years old, dressed in a faded military jacket, a leather shoulder bag across his body, wearing worn-out boots that had lost their shape, walked into the precinct. No one stopped him. He didn't need to show identification. No one asked his name, perhaps because he walked as if he knew every tile on the floor, as if this wasn't the first time he had stepped into a place meant to represent justice. He walked straight to the public desk, placed both hands on the wooden counter, looked up, and said in a hoarse but firm voice, "I need to see Marlene Ellis. I'm Howard Matthews. In 1968, she saved my life." The duty officer paused slightly, then glanced toward an official sitting nearby at a terminal. No one said a word, but a few people stood up. They didn't need explanation. No invitation was necessary. Just the name Marlene Ellis was enough to make the whole room seem to tighten, holding its breath. Delroy stood at the far end of the hallway, witnessing everything, from a distance too far to approach and too heavy to walk away from. Howard was invited into the guest room. He did not sit. He simply stood there, his hands resting on the back of the chair in front of him, as though an invisible weight pressed on his chest that only a woman named Marlene had the strength to hold back. "I'm not here to interfere," he said slowly, each word polished by time. "I'm here because I cannot allow someone who once saved my life to be treated like a criminal." The entire room went still. Only the faint whir of the air conditioner and the hovering pause of a pen suspended mid-air by a recording clerk remained. Howard continued, his voice steady, but saturated with the solemn hue of memory. "That day, summer of 1968, I was 13 years old. Chicago. Two armed groups, one white, one black, pointed their guns at each other right outside my house. My brother, Tommy, stood between them, unarmed, trying to stop both sides, and was shot down. I knelt beside my brother's body, my hands helpless. Then, through the bullets, a woman ran out. No bulletproof vest, no shouting. She simply held up a torn copy of the Constitution and stood upright, right between two barrels. He paused for a second, not to breathe, but to prevent his voice from slipping into an emotion he didn't want to expose in front of strangers. She didn't speak loudly, just said one thing: "If you shoot, then shoot through me. But remember, this is not my chest. This is the reason you are allowed to hold that gun without being hanged." He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, then opened them again, locking eyes with the officer seated before him. She carried me out, carried me home herself, while my hands were still covered in my brother's blood. The whole neighborhood knew, but no one dared retell it, because her name was never printed right in any paper. Someone asked softly, "And after that?" Howard's lips curled slightly, half smile, half guilt. "After that I grew up, became a soldier, then a sniper instructor, then retired. I traveled the world, served in combat abroad, taught at the State Police Academy, but never once did I return to find her. Not because I didn't want to, but because I thought she'd probably forgotten or had died. I was wrong." He opened his leather bag, took out a worn, frayed wallet. Inside was a small photo, yellowed at the edges, a black and white image. Marlene kneeling beside a blond boy, her hand wiping blood from her own palm with a thin handkerchief. I've kept this photo for 55 years, not for decoration, but to remind myself, if ever I lost my way, this was the point I had to return to. No one said a word, no one moved. The entire room, even the hallway beyond the door, seemed to hold its breath, listening to the last sentence from the old soldier. He looked straight out the window, not at anyone. Not blaming, not emotional, just left one statement behind, slow, weighty, like a moral sentence sent across generations. If she was ever humiliated by this system, then this entire country is in her debt. Then he bowed, not as a formality, but as a true apology. He whispered, just loud enough for himself to hear, "I apologize on behalf of every white man who ever called her unworthy, because that day only she stood between the guns. The rest of us, including my brother, chose to stand behind slogans." He heard and was still standing in the hallway. He heard every word. Each sentence hit his ears like bullets traveling backward through time, aimed straight at everything he once thought he stood for. No one blamed him, no one pointed fingers, but the confession of an old soldier, not even addressed to him, was the sharpest blow of all, because it was directed at a generation that thought itself the pillar, without realizing it was repeating the mistakes of those before. When Howard stepped out of the room, he did not look at Delroy, but their eyes met for a brief instant, long enough for Delroy to understand. An apology is not an action, it is a legacy, and there are some people who only need to stand before you for you to know you no longer have the right to lift your head. When Howard Matthews walked out of the police precinct, he left no message behind, didn't look back. But the clip capturing his testimony, secretly recorded by an unnamed staffer at the reception desk, took only 6 hours to become the epicenter of the entire media landscape. There was no violence in the footage, no blood, no confrontation, just an old man with silver hair, wrinkled hands, holding a faded photo and recounting a moment between two barrels of guns, where a woman, unarmed, unarmored, silent, stood in the one place all armed men had avoided, the center. No one summoned the media, but some stories, when told right, don't need to be spread, they spread themselves. The black and white photo of Marlene wiping blood from Howard's hand in 1968 was rediscovered by a reporter at the Sentinel in an unpublished digital archive, and by nightfall, it appeared on the front page, bearing a headline that needed no editing, because she was never a legend, because she was always real. The photo was adjusted to grayscale, but no other edits were made. The bloodstain remained faint, her eyes still deep, her hands steady, the handkerchief thin and trembling at her fingertips. There was no plea in her expression, no dramatized posture, and because of that, the image became something people could not scroll past. Within just 12 hours, it was reposted across more than 500 newspapers, personal blogs, educational forums, and even aired on national evening news broadcasts. Marlene Ellis's name was re-tagged across government archival systems. A series of sealed files, once frozen for security reasons, were gradually declassified under the directive to restore records of high-impact figures in judicial community history. From a name that had once been mistaken for dozens of others in the Citizen Data Bank, she became the most searched term across the federal legal and educational systems overnight. Then came education. An Asian American educator and educator, Professor Tran Vien, a medal recipient for his contributions to federal law curriculum reform, posted a short handwritten note on his personal account. No links, no hashtags, just a memory. "I used to study law through textbooks, but I understood law because of the stories she told." No lecture voice, no PowerPoint, just a woman seated in an unnamed classroom with hands that had once carried dead children, signed de-escalation orders, and knelt beside the mother of a white soldier mistakenly shot for being black. His final line, just 7 words, "She was the one who taught me law." Right after that post, a quiet movement began on social media. No one started it, yet person by person, stories resurfaced of things they'd once heard her say, seen her do, or felt through her gaze while passing the community center. Then came the hashtag, not flashy, not boosted by ads, Marlene is America. It spread slowly but steadily, from lecture halls to courtrooms, from small law student groups to veterans organizations, from women who had once been denied job interviews to men who had once been wrongly convicted because of their skin color. No one called her a victim. No one proclaimed her a hero. They simply referred to her exactly as one citizen in Ohio had written on her chalkboard. She is what America was supposed to be. Delroy saw all of this, not through official reports, not through internal briefings, but on his own phone in the middle of the night. No one sent it to him, no friend tagged him, but he saw it, every clip, every photo, every comment. Familiar faces reappeared from memories he had never considered important. People who had once stepped back when Marlene stepped forward. Children who had once asked why she was being yelled at, now all speaking out, and that voice, they could no longer be silenced. His hand held the phone, the blue light casting onto his face, illuminating creases that had never been visible before. Not from age, but from the fracture in how he once viewed the world. He read the comments, the quotes, the stories. No one mentioned his name, but the story of what he had done was retold, detail by detail, minute by minute, word for word, unnamed, but unmistakably about him. On a legal forum, someone wrote, "I used to think power lay in the badge, but today I saw a pair of patched shoes, an old canvas bag, and a gaze that rewrote the meaning of justice." That sentence Delroy read 3 times, the first out of anger, the second out of doubt, the third in silence. No one called for his resignation. No one demanded his firing. No hashtag trended seeking punishment, but that only made it worse, because the silence of others, once they knew he was wrong, was a punishment no tribunal could ever issue. And that night, for the first time in years, Delroy could not sleep. He sat by his desk in a small apartment with no family photos. The computer was on. One tab showed an article about Marlene. The other, a draft of a leave of absence letter. He didn't write it, didn't type. He just let it sit, because what needed to be written wasn't in that letter. It was in the fact that the woman who once wiped blood from the son of a soldier was still alive, still walking among the streets, and had still never called him her enemy. And that, to him, hurt more than any sentence ever could. On the long wooden table inside Hearing Room 3 at the Capitol, dark gray suits and bold nameplates were arranged neatly. The overhead lighting was bright enough to avoid glare, but not so soft as to permit any shadow. Cameras were in place, microphones had been sound-checked, banner reading "Federal Police Reform Draft Special Hearing" hung centered across the backdrop, and beneath it sat one vacant chair, padded in olive green with laminated wooden armrests and a brass nameplate already mounted. Marlene H. Ellis, Chief Witness Advisor, but that chair was never filled. The congressional clerk received the handwritten envelope precisely on Tuesday morning, 5 minutes after the session commenced. There was no postmark, no return address, just one line in black ink on the envelope. Reply to the invitation dated the 12th. Inside was a piece of paper written in violet ink, the handwriting round, firm, and slanted, just enough to show the writer had nothing to prove, but every letter pressed deep like pins aimed at the delicate balance politicians were trying to strike between image and action. The letter contained just 2 lines. "I do not answer to a system that once silenced me through organized silence. If you seek witnesses, listen to those whose voices were lost before mine." There was no signature, none needed, because just the name Marlene Ellis sent the entire hearing room, meant to be the stage for those who had once thought they could use her name as a launch pad for reform, into 7 full seconds of absolute stillness. No one spoke. No one chuckled nervously, no one tried to explain it away, and when the spokesperson read the letter aloud verbatim, a House representative muttered, off mic, but audible enough, she just turned down a reform that could have been named after her. The news spread rapidly. Within 30 minutes, dozens of media outlets had reported the letter's content. Half called it a historic refusal, the other half labeled it a destructive act of stubbornness. Legal experts debated it on live TV. Some argued she had squandered the chance to etch her name into a new era. Others insisted it was the highest form of resistance from someone who had once been backed into a corner, turning her back on the very stage those in power had built for her to act out their script. Liberty Watch ran a screaming headline, "A legend of resistance," or "a symbol of stubbornness." Common Ground countered. She declined medals, titles, advisory roles, because she knew Not all justice needs a nameplate. The handwritten letter spread like a manifesto that never chanted slogans. There was no mention of struggle, righteousness, or sacrifice, yet it forced those who were long accustomed to compromise to bow their heads and re-examine how much truth they had sold for a sliver of platform. In a closed-door meeting of the Judicial Reform Committee, the chairman, a salt-and-pepper-haired former prosecutor, renowned for handling numerous police misconduct cases, exhaled deeply and said, "I wanted her seated next to me at that hearing. I wanted to give her the microphone, the spotlight, and even the apology. But maybe she understood something we forgot, that when a system needs justice to fix its image, justice should not show up." That same night, on social media, a photo of someone handwriting the letter's contents on plain paper was reposted millions of times. No logo, no hashtags, no filters, just handwriting on white paper, the ink pressed darker on the words silenced and organized silence. In old housing complexes in West Baltimore, where two black mothers had once had their homes illegally searched by police with no apology, residents printed those two lines and taped them to their weathered wooden doors. In law schools, students stood up to read the letter aloud as an unofficial invocation before exams. At a juvenile correctional center, the administrator pinned the letter to the bulletin board and told the kids, "They can take everything from you, with laws, with force, with prejudice, but if you don't want them to take your voice, then stop answering." That night, Delroy did not sleep. He sat in his room, the glow of his phone again casting light on his face, this time not from short clips, but the full text of Marlene's letter, published by The Atlantic, alongside an editorial titled, "Refusal as a Form of Deliverance." They called it a moment when someone once made to stand before the system did not beg it to do right, did not force it to change, but simply refused to return. Delroy read the sentence, "I do not answer to a system that once silenced me through organized silence." He didn't understand it right away, but inside, something stirred, a sound so faint like a distant door softly closing, not loud, but clear enough to let whoever was left behind know they had just been locked out. And for the first time, he fully understood the price of integrity. Not blood, not prison, but the courage to say no, precisely when everyone else is waiting for a yes. Not to provoke, but to remind that justice is not something anyone can volunteer to represent, and that some names require no gold plating. They only need to be written properly, by hand, in ink, in silence. And that alone is enough to make an entire system scramble to justify its own existence. That night, while the media was still reeling from the ripple effects of Marlene's letter of refusal, another image, simpler, quieter, began appearing across student social media platforms. No filter, no logos, no hashtags, just a chalkboard in a Milwaukee high school classroom. In the center was a black and white photo of Marlene, printed on office paper, its edges still uneven from the blade. Beneath it, written in capital letters with white chalk and double underlined, "Today, we learn from a person." There was no subject line. No date needed. But within one morning, over 50 schools nationwide, from Atlanta to Sacramento, from suburban classrooms to elite university lecture halls, had chalkboards just like it. Some bore different phrases. Not everyone needs a nameplate to be decent. Some displayed poems written by students, inspired by the look in Marlene's eyes the day she walked out of the police precinct, calling it a gaze that demanded no debt but made the whole country reckon with itself. In New Jersey, a first-grade class held its usual "Who's a Hero" session. The teacher gently asked if someone helps others without needing to be named, what would you call them? A little girl with curly hair stood up and raised her hand. Her answer rang out, clear and simple, "Grandma Marlene." What moved the teacher was not the answer itself, but what followed. No cue, no rehearsal. The whole class echoed her name as if it were a reflex of moral instinct. Grandma Marlene. No movement had been launched, no one assigned any task. Yet each small act, a photo taped to a board, a sentence scribbled on paper, a lesson plan adjusted to include one ethics period based on a real person, linked together like an electric current hitting the right wire. A short video created by a student at a Seattle high school, shot only on a phone, retelling the event in his own voice, no background music, no outraged inflection, reached 3 million views in less than 24 hours. He ended the video with this line: "If she could remain silent through the blows and still make justice speak, then why are we silent in classrooms full of light?" At a law school in Boston, students organized a mock trial. No defendant, no jury, just one question posed to the auditorium. Is silence a crime when it comes from the system? A female student stood and spoke, her clip shared hundreds of thousands of times. "We're not demanding Delroy be fired. We demand the system that protected him take a long, hard look at itself. Because if no one had recorded that day, if Marlene didn't have a history that couldn't be erased, she would have been shoved into a van like anyone else. We won't wait until it's our mother. We won't wait until it's ourselves." Hundreds of letters of support were sent to the law office that once represented Marlene. The most widely shared came from a parent in Louisiana, Mrs. Sherry Banks, who had once been pulled over and verbally assaulted by Delroy 15 years ago. In her letter, she wrote, "Back then, I stayed silent. No lawsuit, no protest, no resistance, because I had 2 kids I needed to get home safe. But today, they're not kids anymore, and today, they won't stay silent like I did. Thank you, Miss Marlene, for reminding us not to let fear make us shadows." That letter was read aloud at a city council meeting, and when it ended, the entire room stood, not by protocol, not because anyone called for it. They just stood for 10 seconds, as if to send something to a woman who was not present, but present in every reflex of conscience. In a juvenile correctional facility in Texas, the drill instructor, a tall white man previously known for teaching defensive tactics, dedicated an entire session to reading Marlene's story to the boys. No one cracked jokes. No one dozed off. One kid asked, "Was she good at fighting?" He shook his head. "No, but she knew how to stand still at the right time." The room went quiet. Another asked, "What does she do now?" "She doesn't do anything," he replied, "but the whole country is relearning right and wrong from her name." At the Department of the Interior in California, a senior official exclaimed during a closed-door session, "We can write as many reform plans as we want, but if the younger generation doesn't believe in them, every draft is just PR." The only one to respond was a young female aide, freshly graduated from a policy school. Young people don't need reform, they need someone real. And the name Marlene Ellis, with no medals, no statues, no official Wikipedia page, now lived on as a subtle fracture in the curriculum, as a single droplet on the wooden ruler of moral measure. No one mandated it, but everyone referenced it. At the small home where she still lived, in a quiet corner of Chicago, she didn't turn on the television, didn't use social media. She brewed her tea, as always, read her books, as she did every day. But that morning, an envelope had been slipped through the door slot. No sender. Inside was a blank sheet of paper, drawn in crayon, a messy sketch of her standing between 2 shouting groups. She held no weapon, only her eyes. Beneath the image was a child's unsteady handwriting. "If I grow up like you, my mom won't be scared anymore." She folded the paper, said nothing, just placed it in the top drawer, the one that once held an old photograph, also of a child, but from the year 1968. The office door closed softly behind Marlene, not with a bang, but in the minds of those who had once witnessed that gaze inside the police precinct, the sound felt like a historical lock snapping into place. It didn't echo, it didn't roar, it didn't demand to leave a trace, but those who heard it remembered it. The next morning, at a federal detention center in southern St. Louis, a large sentence written in white chalk appeared on the central notice board of the internal briefing room. If we need someone to stand between two gun barrels, just to remind us we're human, then perhaps we no longer deserve the badge. No one signed it. No one claimed to have written it. But those who read it knew it didn't need a name, because for the first time, the question was not outside. It was pinned to the center of every uniformed chest. The silence within the force, once assumed to mean agreement, began to crack, not through manifestos, but through signs. A young officer in Boston declined a medal, saying he did not want to be rewarded by overlooking a colleague's wrongdoing. A female officer in Albuquerque submitted her resignation with a short letter, not preachy, simply written, "I joined to maintain order, but if order means institutionalizing what is wrong, then I no longer have the strength to call this a profession." At the State Department of Internal Affairs, a personnel file was sent to a senior administrator. A veteran unit leader had refused to lead a school protest control operation, stating, "No one has the right to suppress what I once taught my children." A sheet bearing Marlene's photograph was clipped to the file, not to persuade, just to remind, we once had a role model, and we forgot. Inside officer training modules, instructors began rewriting their lectures. Marlene's name was added to community conflict resolution lessons, not as a moral tale, but as a reference point between reflexive power and the instinct to listen. Some cadets quietly asked more about her after class, not for grades, but because they felt the world deserved a better way to begin. One of them, not yet graduated, sent an email to the academy's director. "If I must learn to control crowds, then please teach me how not to become one." Within the very police department where Delroy once served, a closed-door meeting was held, not by command, but at the request of those who once reported to him. No shouting, no public dissent, but one question was repeated 3 times by 3 different people. If we can no longer be proud of the person in the mirror, who will be proud of us? Delroy was invited but did not enter the room. He stood outside, hand gripping the doorknob, lacking the courage to push it open. Through the glass, he saw subordinates who once patted his back, once called him Big Brother, now nodding silently to one another. No one cried, but that very absence of speech said everything about the collapse of a structure once thought untouchable. In Atlanta, a group of former officers launched an open forum called "The Scar is Still Warm," a space where they recounted the injustices they once witnessed in silence. Within a week, the forum had over 2,000 participants. No noisy comments, no arguments, just confessions, short, painful, true. One post read, "In 2009, I watched a colleague slap a black woman and wrote in the report, 'She resisted. I still have a copy of that report, but I can't live with myself.' There was no leader, no organizer. But the system, it began to collapse from the inside, not by sledgehammer, but by the synchronized awakening of conscience. No one wanted to prove themselves right anymore. They only wanted history, this time, not to record their names on the wrong side. And amid that wave of confession, stories needing no verification because the tellers bore the stains themselves, one name began to appear more than any officer ever awarded a title. Not on commendation lists, not in unsung hero forums, but in lines bowed low. "I once looked away when Marlene was pulled over just because her grandson in the front seat was black." Another wrote, "She once sent a letter of feedback to the department. I laughed and tossed it in the trash. Now I reread every word." No one told anyone else what to do, but everyone understood if there was ever someone who never wore a uniform and still made the entire force bow their heads, it was her. Not because she spoke, but because she no longer needed to. Her silence, through the years, through her daughter's death, through court hearings, where she sat alone like a shadow, had become the loudest knock on the door of every officer still bearing the illusion of honor. And one afternoon, seemingly anonymous, a man who once sat in the command chair stepped onto her porch, not to enforce an order, but to bow. The door opened. Marlene stood there, saying nothing. Her silver hair, her face marked with wrinkles like the battle lines of proud silence. She looked at him, not with hatred, not with pity, only one kind of gaze, direct, penetrating, as if she had long since seen him, not the man before her, but the naked and pitiful truth within. Delroy knelt. He no longer had a choice. His knees touched the cold cement, his trembling hands clasped like a child awaiting judgment. No uniform, no badge, no gun to silence others, only a broken voice. "I'm sorry." But Marlene did not waver. She did not approach. She did not push him away. She simply stood there, looking at him the way one looks into a cracked mirror, seeing every truth one wishes not to admit. And then she spoke, a voice soft but heavy, like the final bell of a courtroom's last session. "You don't need to apologize to me. You've owed that apology to your mother for a long time." No other sound, no crying, not even wind. Everything seemed to fall still before those words. But within Delroy something shattered, not because he was forgiven, but because he understood. He had just been sentenced. No handcuffs, no courtroom, just a single sentence. And he had lost the last thing he still clung to, dignity. He wept. Not from remorse, but because for the first time he realized he had never truly understood what justice meant. His entire life, justice was the gun, the arrest warrant, the right to stomp on someone's face when they were down. It was a pre-signed report, a distorted testimony, the sideways glances of others while he punished the innocent, the silence of the system. What he once believed was consent had only ever been cowardice in uniform. A small camera across the street, set up by a group of students hoping to capture the meeting, recorded the entire moment. A man who once was a police officer, now kneeling sobbing like a child before an old woman who bore no grudge, only a sentence that brought an entire belief system to its knees. The video spread across social media. Within 4 hours, it had been shared over 3 million times. National news aired it, newspapers headlined it, podcasts analyzed every word. But no commentary struck deeper than one simple line. That sentence was not forgiveness, it was judgment. No one knew who wrote that line, but the hundreds of thousands of likes needed no attribution. People understood, people felt it, and people collectively acknowledged. For the first time, a police officer lost his post, not because he broke protocol, but because he lost what made him human. Delroy staggered to his feet. He did not wipe his tears. There was no one left to prove anything to, no face to save. He walked away like a torn shadow, each step sinking deeper into the wreckage of what he once called a profession. No one saw him off, no one spoke. Only Marlene's back, slow, steady, and upright, walking inside and closing the door. No lock, no latch. But to Delroy, that door would never open again. Hours later, the police department officially confirmed that Delroy had submitted an unpaid leave request and it had been accepted. The press called it voluntary resignation, but social media didn't let it go. A new hashtag surfaced, the final sentence. Thousands of users reposted Marlene's words, pasted them on walls, printed them on shirts, attached them to internal complaints, not to glorify her, but to remind one another of the final line between power and principle. And amid it all, Marlene gave no further statements. She granted no interviews. She wrote no memoirs. She attended no forums. She simply continued living as if silence was the last choice left to those who had endured too much meaningless noise. But people still remembered that image, her slow yet upright walk, as if no force on earth could bend the spine of someone whose moral compass had never wavered. And Delroy, a man who once believed a gun and a uniform were enough to hold everything together, was now left with nothing but 2 empty hands and a sentence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A sentence that stripped him of being a police officer, stripped him of everything. Here is the precise, fully faithful English translation of the provided Vietnamese text, with every number written in full words, no omissions or additions, and structured as a seamless narrative without arbitrary line breaks. The atmosphere in the following days was no longer disturbed by sirens or subpoenas. The city grew quieter, not because peace had returned, but because something had just been rewritten, silently, without statement. An invisible flame still burned, but it carried no smoke. And where that flame had smoldered for nearly half a century, a surprising decision was issued. The prestigious Evergreen Law Academy, known for training hundreds of prosecutors and dozens of federal judges, issued an internal notice, then sent out invitations nationwide. Within 1 month, the Academy's largest auditorium, formerly named after a well-known white benefactor, was renamed Marlene H. Ellis Hall. No fanfare, no ribbon cutting, no honorary guests, just a small bronze plaque installed at dawn by students from the Justice and Sociology class of 2025. None of them had ever met Marlene, but each of them knew her, not through lectures, but through the eyes of those once ridiculed in courtrooms, through the silence of those who once stood alone between the lines of power. They did not call her a victim. They did not call her an inspiration either. In their words, there was only one: reality. At the entrance of the hall's main foyer, a new statue was erected. Not too large, not heroic in style. It depicted a woman standing in a simple pose, not raising a fist, not standing at a podium. An old fabric coat, short hair, eyes gazing far away. But where her right hand rested on her chest, there was a small plate. No academic titles, no job listed, only one line, engraved so deeply that one could almost hear its echo with every reading. It was once cursed on the street, but I never bowed to what was wrong. That sentence spread faster than any fashionable speech. The press quoted it, speakers repeated it, student groups rushed to print it on graduation caps. But oddly enough, the wider it spread, the harder it became for people to explain why it sent shivers down their spine. It did not chant. It did not demand. It was simply like a mirror placed in the middle of the road, forcing anyone who passed to look at themselves. No award ceremony was held, no tribute video was made, yet within 2 weeks the Academy's administrative office received over 100 handwritten letters from students, alumni, and even those who had never set foot in Evergreen. A freshman wrote, "I never thought justice had a shape. Now I know. It looks like a mother who knows she cannot win against society, but still does not teach her child to bow." An alumnus from the class of 1998, now a state prosecutor, wrote, "I used to teach morality through law, but Marlene made me understand. Sometimes the law must relearn morality from the human heart." In a closed colloquium for senior professors, a Jewish white scholar, 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner, said only one sentence before quietly leaving the room. She never asked for power. She became it. No one objected. No one stood up to shake hands, but the entire room fell silent, not out of fear, but out of shame. They, those who had written books, those who had designed social ethics curricula, none had ever been cursed on the street and still managed to preserve the axis of their conscience like that woman did. No aura, no title, but she stood there, a living milestone in a storm-tossed era. And amid all the reverence, Marlene never appeared. People sent thank you letters, flowers, greeting cards, but none received a reply. A group of students visited her house, only to quietly place a bouquet of white chrysanthemums at the gate. A boy in the group stood still, then finally said a sentence that made everyone choke up. "We came to thank her, but seeing this house, I feel she doesn't need that. She only needs us to live exactly as she believes." A photograph, taken by a reporter, secretly, spread across student forums. Marlene, sitting on her porch, reading a book, with an old radio beside her, broadcasting the news. The light of dusk shone on her wrinkled face without dimming its serenity. She had no idea she had become a new chapter in the textbook on justice. But that no longer mattered, because she never did anything to be remembered. She simply lived, in a way that her very existence became the quietest challenge to all the falsehoods around her. A woman without grandeur, yet a genius. Not because she was smarter, but because among countless others who chose silence to survive, she chose to stand tall so as not to disappear. And because she did not disappear, the entire system no longer dared to look away. She still did not speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because some things, when deep enough, need not be spoken. After the stormy hearing, after the half-hearted handshakes and the belated apologies broadcast on television, she declined all invitations to receive awards, from the Human Rights Commission, from the Federal Council, even from the very organizations that once turned their backs before she did what the entire system had stayed silent on for far too long. The press called it an act of humility, but those who truly understood her knew it was not humility, it was a choice. She chose not to step onto a stage built from delayed applause. She chose silence. So when a video surfaced showing her at a small ceremony at Oak Ridge Elementary School, many thought it was fake. No banners, no escort vehicles, no flashing cameras. Just a clear morning, a schoolyard still damp with dew, and her, in a charcoal cardigan, laying out old books one by one on rows of tables. Each book had a handwritten inscription, the penmanship shaky but careful. Those pages spoke not of glory or triumph, but of courage in silence, of truth that needs no courtroom's certification, of children growing up not needing to set an example just to live rightly. A little girl, about 8 years old, her face smudged with pastel dust, looked up from a stone bench and asked, with open curiosity, "Who are you, ma'am?" She looked at the child for a moment, then bent down, resting her hand gently on the girl's tangled hair. No surprise, no pride, just a tenderness that seeped through her fingertips. Someone who doesn't want you to have to fight for what's right, just to live in peace. A sentence light as the wind, but for those who have lived through years bent by silence, it struck with the weight of a punishment, and as precisely as a declaration, the children fell quiet. Teachers stood behind the wire gate, none saying a word. Someone turned on their phone to record. Then another. Then the whole schoolyard, with tiny eyes gazing upward, seemed to witness something that could not be named, but also could not be forgotten. No one knew when she left the schoolyard. Some said she simply walked to the bus stop at the end of the street. Others claimed an elderly driver had been quietly waiting since dawn. But that did not matter, because right after she left, a third-grade student, the same boy once suspended for fighting back when someone called his mother a dumb waitress, quietly took a piece of white chalk and wrote on the old wall behind the library, "She is justice without armor." No journalist reported it, no exclusive interview aired, but the clip posted by a teacher on social media, less than 2 minutes long, was shared millions of times overnight. People did not need to know her name, no resume, no golden list of achievements. They just needed to hear that voice, low, steady, unwavering, and see her eyes as she placed the books on the table, as if each one was a shield for a child never protected by any system. A small newspaper in Nebraska, one still printed by hand, was the first to comment on the clip. The editorial was brief, but deep as a hymn. Kindness, when resolute, will echo on its own. And if anyone asks where justice lives, point them to that schoolyard. Not long after, a handwritten manuscript appeared in the mailbox of the National Teachers Association. No author's name. Its content was a single sentence. Justice is not victory. Justice is the perseverance that never trades away its soul. They framed it behind glass, hanging it in the main hall just below the national flag. No one confirmed it was hers, but no one denied it either. Meanwhile, those who had once pointed fingers at her called her a public menace, a crazy old woman who didn't know her place, a system burner, began vanishing from public discourse one by one. One resigned, one issued an apology through their attorney, another, who once mocked her in the middle of a hearing, was exposed in a recording ridiculing a sexual assault victim. No one came to their defense. No one protested for their redemption. Silence, Aiel, this time, did not stand with power. She still did not respond, did not appear, left no statement, but one thing was certain. On the night before her 85th birthday, a woman walked into a small bookstore in Lexington, bought 40 copies of To Kill a Mockingbird, and left a note for the children to know that those who dare to stand alone for what is right are never truly alone. The bookseller did not ask her name, but afterward he renamed the children's reading corner The Quiet Stand, and just beneath the new sign he engraved a small line, as if for those patient enough to read to the end. No need to speak, just never step back. A story that does not end with a period, but with 3 beats of silence. And when another child asked his mother, "Why doesn't she wear armor like superheroes?" the mother simply smiled, "Because she doesn't need to." Justice, true justice, is not something we fight with, it's something we live. That morning, the old wooden door creaked softly, as if exhaling. Marlene did not open it right away. She had just finished steeping a pot of tea, her hands still warm as she stepped onto the porch. On the moss-covered stone steps lay a bouquet of white flowers, unwrapped, no ribbons, tied gently with a thin piece of string like those used for wartime letters. There was no doorbell, no one knocked, but on the damp ground were footprints, 6 pairs, in perfect rows, silent, discreet, like an apology, too ashamed to speak its name. She bent down and picked up the bouquet. Between the jasmine and camellias was a folded note, its edge soaked halfway by the rain. She unfolded it, her hands not trembling but deliberate, as though each crease was a fold in time she had never dared to touch. The words inside were brief, the blue ink smudged but clear enough not to need a second reading. "We would not have entered this profession if it weren't for you." No signature, no titles, no badges. But she knew, she always knew. Those who had bowed to power never wrote such words. Only those who had learned to look victims in the eye and not look away could write something like that. At the same time, in a cafe on the south side of the city, Delroy sat alone in a corner, just about to take out his laptop when a young server approached, not holding a menu, not asking for his order, just quietly said, "We're not refusing you, but we no longer serve those who once made an entire system bow its head." The words were not harsh, not confrontational, but as the server turned away, the eyes of 2 nearby customers remained on Delroy, not judging, not pitying, just the blunt presence of a memory that everyone wanted to bury, yet no one could forgive if it still sat there pretending it belonged. An independent film studio that had once hired Delroy as a consultant on a crime series removed all episodes crediting his name after a post-production staffer found an old email in which Delroy had written, "Silence is consent if the victim doesn't know how to fight back." The leaked message spread like remnants of an era, when others' pain was considered fair game for public relations strategy. There was no apology issue, no statement released, just one line quietly added to the end credits. This series does not accept guidance from anyone who has forgotten how to listen. He withdrew from all social platforms, but a short op-ed column reignited public memory. "We once let him define what stability meant for this field. Maybe it's time to redefine the field itself, starting by not calling it a field, but calling it humanity." Thousands of shares turned the sentence into an unofficial motto for the new generation of recruits. During an oath ceremony at the academy, one young cadet raised his hand a beat later than the rest, just to place it over the printed motto stitched inside his uniform. A small act, no one filmed it, but a photo of that moment, captured unintentionally by a journalist covering the event, became a symbol of a generation that no longer bowed to bureaucratic pressure. In a neighboring state, a law library canceled all scheduled guest lectures by Delroy. No announcement, no scandal, just a rejection letter, printed in an old serif font, filed under the electronic folder labeled Fall Curriculum Updates. Under his name, a faint note was added, "Removed from system, not aligned with current philosophy of social ethics education." A student posted a screenshot with a short caption, "When a name is removed, not because of a mistake, but because it no longer deserves to sit beside the truth. No one corrected the grammar, no hashtags were added, but the sentence quietly settled in the minds of many as if it were a draft of how society purges itself without needing grand declarations. And because of that, she did not cry, did not shed a tear. She merely folded the note gently, like folding a pre-written obituary for the part of the system's humanity that had already died. She stepped back inside. The living room hadn't changed in decades. The scent of old wood, the slanted light slipping through a sheer white curtain, the ticking of the wall clock striking each beat with gravity, not to remind of time passing, but to underline that some things never pass. She opened the drawer beside the wall, the one everyone thought only held old papers. But inside, tucked in the center of a dark wooden compartment, was a photograph. The colors had faded, the frame had a chipped corner, but the eyes in the image still bright. A black man in a white shirt, arm around a young blonde student, blood still soaking into the sleeve, both faces lifted, but only one would survive. 1969, a protest night in Jackson. A white student named Elliot Campbell was surrounded by a mob. His classmates ran. The police watched, and when a brick flew through the air like fate, it was her husband who stepped in, shielding the student with his own body. The bullet from a Colt .45, fired by police, pierced his heart. No investigation, no indictment, no one held accountable. Just a single line in the report, shot amid chaos. Not many knew the story, but the same week Delroy's name was scrubbed from official documents, someone uploaded a scanned copy of that 1969 file to Reddit, along with the original uncropped photo. For the first time, the internet saw both faces, the one who died and the one who lived. A history student reposted it with a single caption. The question isn't who pulled the trigger. It's why did everyone stay silent? The phrase was printed on hundreds of t-shirts within 2 days, not for sale, but to be worn in front of the police headquarters where Delroy once worked. No slogans, no banners, just silence. Steady, like the ticking clock Marlene still heard every night. At a regional security conference, when organizers attempted to replay an old video of Delroy speaking on neutrality in law enforcement, the projector suddenly shut off. Not a technical fault. A technician had unplugged it himself. He turned to the supervisor behind him and said clearly, "We're not letting a room full of young minds be forced to watch a lesson so outdated no one even dares ask when it stopped being right." The entire hall stood up, not to walk out, but to begin a new discussion on ethical neutrality, inspired by Marlene herself, who had never once addressed the public. That same night, on a live broadcast talk show, when the host casually mentioned Delroy's name as a classic example of inner conflict in civil service, a guest, who happened to be a social activist, cut in abruptly. He did not argue. He simply recounted how Delroy had once refused to reopen his case, even though the file was complete. The studio went silent. The stage lights made the guest's face appear darker, drawn tight from held-back tears, but he said nothing more. The audience did not applaud. The host did not turn to apologize. The crew cut the broadcast 10 minutes early without explanation. The next day, the entire recording was removed from all official platforms, but the leaked clip continued to spread, accompanied by a spliced caption, not because he was wrong, but because he did it thinking no one would remember. She had kept that photograph for more than 50 years, never flaunting it, never retelling the story, never building it into a legend, because she knew true justice does not require evidence. It only requires witnesses who survived. And she lived, not to reclaim anything, but to remind that some deaths, if not remembered, will return in more sophisticated forms. Beneath the frame, on a yellowed scrap of paper, she had written in brown ink, "I live so he will not be forgotten." Outside her window, 6 individuals in blue uniforms stood several meters away, not approaching. They said nothing. One bowed deeply. Another removed his cap. A third pulled out his badge, kissed it softly, then placed it back into his left chest pocket, as if asking permission for a promise that could never be withdrawn. Among them was someone once reprimanded for refusing an order to knee a handcuffed man. Another had been suspended for reporting a colleague who pepper-sprayed a minor in a vehicle. And another, once a guard at a detention facility, had left the force after witnessing Marlene at a hearing, only to restart his path at a community-funded police academy. No one spoke. But as the wind passed, a cap slipped from the youngest's hand and rolled to her feet. She did not bend to pick it up. The young man stepped forward, bowed low, retrieved it, and looked up at her, eyes shimmering but unshaken. And for the first time in years, she nodded. A nod not of congratulations, nor of forgiveness, but to acknowledge they understood. Not far away, behind a security gate still bearing an old nameplate, a group of reporters waited, not to interview her. They faced the opposite direction, cameras aimed at Delroy, who had just exited an internal meeting described as a communications department restructuring. As he moved toward a car, a technician's screen accidentally replayed an old clip on the LED display, the one where he once declared, "The public should trust law enforcement, because if not, they'll be ruled by emotion." The sound echoed across the open courtyard. No one commented, but a young backstage crew member standing nearby said, just loud enough to be heard, "I think emotions are what help us survive when the system feels nothing." No camera turned toward her, but a reporter recorded the line and used it as a caption under a photo of Delroy stepping into the car, no one opening the door for him. On social media, a spliced segment from the old hearing resurfaced. A simple overlay read, "Do you still remember who never bowed?" Below it, an image of Marlene, sitting quietly in a crowded room, her hand resting on her knee, gaze unwavering. Alongside was a contrasting photo. Delroy leaving the podium, face pale, shoulders slumped, as if something indefinable had slipped away. Overnight, hundreds of comments appeared beneath the post with the same sentence. Not everyone needs to shout to make the system listen. Some just need to sit. At a conference on Northern Regional Security Reform, the host attempted to invite Delroy to share his experience on post-crisis media management. But as his name was announced, an entire row of seats stood up and exited the hall. No commotion, no protest, no slogans. Within 2 minutes, the first 3 rows were empty. The person behind the podium dared not call his name again. The organizers were forced to change the topic to restoring community trust. Delroy's scheduled speech was cut without notice. In the evening news, the local station summarized it in a single line. The third speaker had no audience. At a roadside diner run by a veteran, a group of young officers came in for lunch. They noticed an old photo of Delroy, once posted behind the counter as a reformer, had been flipped backward. In its place was a handwritten quote, "We do not hang photos to recall the past. We rebuild decency so no one has to retell it in blood." One young officer snapped a photo and posted it with the caption, "Starting today, I vow not to make anyone nod out of shame." The image was shared more than 200,000 times in 2 days, appearing in newspapers before Delroy even knew his name had been removed from the Federal Strategic Advisory List. And for the first time in years, she nodded. A nod not of congratulations, nor of forgiveness, but to acknowledge they understood. That afternoon, no one said her name. No one mentioned a title, but in their hearts, the image of the old woman, standing quietly behind the door, hands holding a bouquet, became the first chapter in a new definition of the people's police, not through slogans, but through the act of bowing. At the same time, a brief submission appeared in the citizen feedback column of a local newspaper. Just one paragraph. "He once signed my hiring letter, but today I can't bring myself to tell my child that story." Thousands of comments followed, not to condemn Delroy, but to admit one truth. Shame does not require public outrage. It only takes the eyes of a child looking at a past adults have excused for far too long. Within less than 48 hours, a new hashtag emerged, "No need to shout names," topping national search trends. No images attached, no logos, just a quiet refusal that honor does not come from the chair one sits in, but from the moment one stands and walks away from the crowd when it matters. At a professional training school, Delroy's portrait once hung in the center hallway of the teaching block. Someone had turned it face down against the wall. At first, they thought it was a prank. But the next morning, every final year student turned their chairs around during the ethics class. When a lecturer asked them to sit properly, no one argued, but no one obeyed either. The program director stood and said, "If the chair no longer faces the truth, then teaching ethics is no better than training in avoidance." The moment was captured by a guest student, auto-captioned, and shared like an emergency crash course in law enforcement, not accredited by any institution, but accepted by society as a collective reckoning. At an event hosted by the Regional Law Enforcement Organization, where Delroy had once been honored with a silver medal for 10 years of service, this year's guest list left his name blank without explanation. When the MC reached his name, his voice faltered, then fell silent. Someone in the room, unclear whether guest or staff, quietly stepped onto the stage, held the mic but said nothing. He simply raised his phone, showing the whole auditorium an image of Marlene standing behind her door, arms wrapped around white flowers. No words, no clarification, but applause broke out. For the first time, not for a title, but for a silent replacement that asked no permission, because those who are truly strong do not need to shout, they only need to be silent at the right moment and bow to the right person. As dusk fell over her porch, she lit a small oil lamp, not to illuminate the path, but to preserve memory. For there are memories that, if not lit, become ghosts, lurking behind cold legal clauses and performative speeches. And on that desk, where her husband's photo still stood between the line of life and death, a new bouquet appeared. For the first time, not to mourn, but to give thanks. Not from the victors, but from those who once bowed at the right moment. But precisely because of those wordless bows, a question began to echo. What should people call her? From the halls of Parliament to the small newsrooms of journalism schools, from Reddit threads to the digital billboards outside National Broadcast Headquarters, the same key word appeared everywhere. Who is Marlene? That evening, on a live television program, a guest who was a former federal judge was invited to comment on the Marlene phenomenon. When asked whether she should be awarded an honorary citizenship medal, he merely smiled faintly, then spoke slowly. Giving a medal to someone the system once ignored is just a way for the system to wash its face, not to honor her. That line, seemingly quiet, instantly became the opening quote for more than 30 editorials in just 2 days, each one a surgical exposure of truths long concealed beneath polish. And throughout that entire media upheaval, not a single word mentioned Delroy's name, as if history had made a deliberate choice to remember what was right and to erase the wrong with the coldest silence possible. At a small bookstore in the suburbs, where Delroy once autographed books as a guest speaker on ethics and law enforcement, the owner replaced all recommended reads signs with a row of blank papers scrawled in red ink. We no longer sell books written by someone who never read the human soul. On social media, a stranger filmed the moment Delroy walked in, saw the empty shelf where his name used to be, and turned away. No one threw him out. No one shouted, but that 8-second clip drew more than 3 million views and over 40,000 comments, most of them just a broom emoji and a single dot, the default symbol of sweeping away a memory that no longer holds moral worth. At a job fair for former public sector workers, where Delroy hoped to start over, he was asked to present his ID to register. The intake clerk, after checking his information, paused for a long while, then slowly took out a pen and drew a line through his name on the cream-colored paper list. No further words, no request to leave. But the gesture was captured by another nearby applicant on their phone. In the widely circulated video, one can clearly hear the filmer whisper, "This is how society says no," with a single stroke. And for the first time since the hearing, a major national newspaper published a headline that read, "Social Sanction," when no one wants to share a table with you. At his former workplace, the nameplate once affixed to an honorary seat in the internal meeting room was replaced with a plain wooden plaque, no name engraved, only a single laser-cut line, reserved for those who once mistook silence for innocence. When a reporter attempted to interview Delroy's former colleagues, the only answer from the communications officer was, "No one here remembers that person ever worked with us." There was no anger, just a methodical erasure, perfectly procedural and deeply cruel. A symbol? That sounded too ceremonial, as if she were merely an image stamped on a medal someone else would wear while shaking hands with politicians. A warrior? Too loud, as if she had stepped through blood to claim something for herself. An advisor? Too official, as if she belonged to the very system she once dared to shatter. A saint? Too false, too clean, too detached from those who had witnessed her trembling hands fold a student's letter. Too unreal to describe someone who simply lived, right? Without needing any role assigned. The press debated. Some called her the heroine of silent revolutions. Others scoffed. Just another name to slap in textbooks no one reads. One lawmaker even proposed naming a new bill after her, as if turning spirit into signature could somehow bribe conscience, while the elite struggled to sculpt a statue. On the weathered cement floor of a District 7 bus stop, someone etched a short line with a nail. It wasn't that she spoke, it was that we no longer had an excuse to cover our ears. Beside it, the muddy footprint of someone who had stood there reading for a long time. A woman captured the moment, not the person's face, just their shoes and the words, and posted it with the caption, "Some revolutions begin when people can no longer shamelessly turn away." That video spread so fast, the same network that once ignored the Marlene case was forced to dedicate the final 30 seconds of their nightly broadcast to replay it. No logo, no soundtrack, just silence and repetition. At a government-suppressed education conference, her name was mentioned in a session on the role of non-affiliated citizens. A high-ranking official, formerly a communications advisor under the old administration, mocked openly, saying, "Are we really turning an old woman who wouldn't cooperate into our new moral yardstick?" No one reacted. But as he exited the hall, a group of students waited outside, holding up blank white boards, not to shout, but to let him see his reflection. A wordless act, yet captured clearly in a less than 1 minute clip. His name vanished from the speaker list within 3 days. At that very moment, in a middle school classroom in Oakland, a student submitted a civic essay with just one sentence. "She is nothing. She is someone I want to become." No arguments, no citations, no references, but the teacher photocopied it and pinned it to the classroom door. And by the next day it had gone viral as a wake-up call to the world of rhetoric. Some people need no title. They are the answer, not the question. Meanwhile, Delroy, the man who once proudly claimed history will be on my side, was spotted at a cheap diner on the outskirts of town, sitting alone with a tray of cold food. When the waitress was late with his meal, he asked, "Can I get priority service?" The young woman replied without hesitation, "We don't prioritize someone who spent his whole life prioritizing the wrong people." A customer at the next table overheard, quietly recorded the line, and later the audio clip was set as background music for a wave of TikTok videos under the theme, "The moment you realize you're no longer a priority." No one called it revenge. It was simply that society no longer had room for free forgiveness. In another city, under the concrete overpass where many homeless people sheltered through the winter, someone had used charcoal to write on the wall, "She once gave me a cup of coffee, but I kept it for life because she gave me the look of a human being." The writing, smudged by water and stained by dust, was still clearer than any broadcast news ever aired. When Delroy reappeared at a conference on law enforcement reform, this time as an audience member, no longer a speaker, he stood to offer a comment, but his microphone was cut midway. The student coordinator did not apologize, did not adjust the audio, only repeated a line once recorded in the official hearing report. "The signal doesn't come from the mic. The signal comes from integrity. He sat down. No one clapped. And for the first time since the disciplinary hearing, he didn't turn back toward the cameras. Public discourse, once accustomed to noise, began to slow down. Social commentaries shifted from judgment to introspection. For what seemed like the first time in many years, people started asking, not about her, but about themselves, about the way they once passed an elderly woman standing on the sidewalk without a greeting, about the eyes they averted upon seeing a person of color bowing their head inside a convenience store, about the time they told their child, "Don't get involved in that. Silence is how smart people survive." The speeches changed in tone, too. No more lofty quotations, no more promises of reform budgets, only silences. Silences too deep to be interrupted by applause, because no one dared to presume they fully understood what Marlene had done by simply drafting policy papers. That shift did not come from pressure, but from a collective unease, a discomfort no one dared to name, yet all could sense when standing next to someone like Delroy. In a closed-door meeting at the State Police Department, he was invited in the capacity of a former tactical coordinator. As soon as he entered, a row of seats behind him stood up and changed places. No one said a word, but afterward, on the table where he sat, someone had left a scrap of paper with a scribbled message in ballpoint pen. No tactic can save someone no longer worth looking in the eye. A reporter secretly took a photo, and by evening the note was front-page material in a well-known journal on public ethics. At a training camp for young officials, an exercise on dilemmas and justice was based on a mishandled case Delroy had once overseen, but when it came time to identify the coordinator at fault, students unanimously wrote his real name, even though all names had been changed in the case file. A lecturer asked why they hadn't followed the simulated data, and one student answered, "Because it's the truth that stops us from pretending nothing happened." That quote was printed and pinned in the main hall of the Academy of Internal Affairs, replacing an old slogan once taken from a speech by Delroy himself. Everyone who walked past bowed, not for him, but for having once learned from someone unworthy. He once sought to become a guest lecturer at a community college. The interview invitation was sent on time, but when he arrived, the reception area was empty. No secretary, no one opened the door, no water. On the table sat a case file he had signed in a case later thrown out for lack of transparency, clipped together with a rusty paper fastener, and above it, written in pencil, "We are not short on teachers. We are short on those worthy to be called one." No one came out, no formal rejection. He left, and in the security camera footage he could be seen looking around, then turning away, as if realizing he no longer had the right to knock where doors once opened for him. Another elderly woman, whose name had never appeared in any newspaper, lived alone in a poor neighborhood on the outskirts of Detroit. She was suddenly found by the media after a clip surfaced of her standing in silence outside a police station, holding a small sign. "I don't need to be remembered. I just don't want to be forgotten while I'm still alive." The local community raised funds so she could live in decent housing. Law students came to help her rewrite her denied social welfare documents from 2004. People didn't do it because of Marlene, but because of Marlene, they no longer dared to treat indifference as harmless. Somewhere in the city, a student intern at a television station dropped his thesis to produce a short film titled "No One Called But She Came." The film had no dialogue, no soundtrack, just repeated images of an old woman quietly walking through forgotten places, and at the end, only her silhouette remained, under a sky where no one looked. No one expected that this too-quiet film would be selected for screening at a major media awards show, played between flashy bank ads and government campaigns. And right in the lobby of that event, as Delroy appeared in an old suit, with a name tag reading "Honorary Guest," a group of photojournalists simultaneously lowered their cameras. One of them, the same person who had shot his magazine cover 10 years ago, simply said without emotion, "I no longer have a reason to focus on someone who once blurred justice." The line was not recorded, but it spread faster than the image. By nightfall, A photo of Delroy standing alone by the hallway became the symbolic counterpoint to an event meant to honor truth. The film had no sound, but its impact made noise, the sound of doors quietly closing. When Delroy contacted an independent film distributor to pitch a counter-narrative project, the executive replied with a single sentence: "We do not fund those who have silenced others." No rejection had ever been more precise. But what stirred the public was when the letter was leaked, it was discovered that the reply was printed on recycled paper with the logo of a student-led national campaign, a campaign that had originated from the very short film about Marlene. A full-circle moment no one expected, least of all those who once stood at the center of the old circle. Some said the film was too subdued, some said it was unnecessary, but no one watched it without falling silent afterward. At a media ethics conference, a journalist once criticized for sensational headlines about her stood and spoke. "I once called her the icon who defied the system, but in the end, I realized I was wrong. She wasn't swimming against the current. She stood still. We were the ones drifting." As soon as he finished, someone in the audience raised a phone, playing an old news clip showing Delroy smiling when the press had called her the stubborn old lady. His face was cropped from the footage and placed next to her silhouette from the student film. A contrast so stark that netizens shared it with the caption, "These are not two people. These are two directions. One went down, one never moved." In less than 2 hours, the comparison aired as the closing segment on national television. But Delroy didn't see it. His cable subscription had been canceled the week before for failing to meet eligibility for former public servant benefits. And in that moment, at the back of the hall, a young woman stepped out. No one recognized her, just to adjust the microphone, then quietly left. No one asked her name, but someone said that was Marlene's granddaughter. She didn't need to be interviewed, because she knew. Real legacy does. People still ask, what should we call her? But that question, by now, has lost its weight, because in every person who has started to live differently, perhaps that is already the answer. He had never stood before a judge, so she never needed a title to defend herself. On the contrary, the one who deserved judgment was never once recorded as a defendant, because some trials do not require gavels nor prosecutors. Some trials, enough to end a life, need only silence. Delroy's disciplinary hearing took place on a Wednesday morning, inside a small room with no press, no public, no objections. Only an empty chair across from 5 people in gray suits and a microphone that was never turned on. The session ended after 23 minutes. A record with no precedent. No one pleaded his case. No one asked for further evidence. No one requested a second chance, because everyone knew there was nothing left to ask for. On his way out of the building, he walked past the main hallway, where an old group photo hung on the wall, a picture of officers once awarded the department's Medal of Honor. On the glass frame, someone had taped a handwritten note in black marker, the scrawl reading, "Honor is not for those who survive by making others unable to." The message was torn down shortly after, but the image had already been captured by an office worker's camera, and it spread online with a chilling caption, "Time cannot erase what society still remembers." That afternoon, a leaked clip from a security camera showed Delroy leaving the parking lot, only to be stopped not by violence, but by presence. 6 high school students stood in a row in front of his car, each holding a cardboard sign with a single word, forming the sentence, "We will not learn from you." He honked. No one moved. He stepped out of the vehicle, his face hardening, but none of the children ran. They didn't shout. They didn't throw anything. They just looked, like students attending their final ethics class, where the lecturer was the one who once got it wrong. That evening, at a diner near the West Side neighborhood where he used to have dinner on Wednesdays, as he entered, the lights above the counter suddenly went dark, not due to a malfunction. The manager turned to the kitchen staff and said, clearly, "Dim the lights, for those no longer seen as servants of justice." Delroy stood still for a few seconds, then turned and walked away. A customer near the door pushed their chair out just enough to force him to detour around it. A silent rejection, wordless yet sharp enough that the place earned a new name online: Table of the Untouched. The next morning, when he attempted to enter the office of a local newspaper, where he had once been a key source for major stories, to apply as a freelance contributor, a young editor stepped out, looked him in the eyes and said, "This paper doesn't take leads from anyone who once smothered the truth." There was no further exchange, no offer of coffee, just a door that didn't open, a coldness matching exactly what he once inflicted. When asked if he had any final words, Delroy did not rise. He sat there, hands interlocked, eyes fixed on the tiled floor. His voice was low, but each word cut like a blade. "I used to think I was strong, but she never even raised a hand, and I still fell." There was no applause, no sighs, only a printed decision, quietly signed. All positions revoked, certification rescinded, a permanent ban from practice. No formal declaration of guilt, because in this system, the loss of dignity is the verdict. As he exited the administrative building, a young reporter was waiting, not to ask questions, but to say one line. Just as he passed, being expelled from the profession isn't punishment. It's honor itself casting you out. Delroy paused for half a second. He said nothing, but his eyes, the same ones that had once signed off on falsified reports, now looked like a dim, clouded space where no reflection remained. His silence did not stop the public from roaring. That noon, during a morning TV show usually focused on weather and food, the host abruptly changed topics, playing a slow-motion clip of Delroy walking out the back of the building with a voiceover. There are those who were once called the scales of justice, but turned out to be the weight that tilted it. On social media, thousands of shares carried the hashtag #FallenBecauseNotTrusted, turning his lonely figure into the counterman of the legendary graffiti wall. That same afternoon, when Delroy tried to enter a pharmacy to purchase essentials, the clerk looked up at him, said nothing, and rang a bell for the manager. The manager, a middle-aged woman whose son had once been wrongfully punished in a case signed by Delroy, pointed to a small sign by the entrance: "We do not serve those who once denied the truth." No arguments, no yelling. But the wind chime on the shop door rang again as he was shown out, and in the clip that captured it, no gaze in the room treated him like a customer anymore. That night, a journalism student posted an old internal email from Delroy in which he mocked, "Nobody cares about the testimony of an old woman who can't even turn on a recorder." The email was printed and pinned to the brick wall where the iconic graffiti once appeared. Beneath it, in red ink, "No need to record. Society remember." That image spread across law student forums, printed as a poster for a campaign titled "Don't Be Silent Like Delroy," a slogan that highlighted not legal failure, but the price of a life lived without integrity. The peak came during a student forum at his former school, where Delroy had been a guest lecturer a decade ago. When his name was mentioned during an audience question, the hall fell silent. A student stood and said into the mic, "I used to think justice belonged to those in power, but today I believe justice is when a society forgets the name it once worshipped." The moderator made no comment, but the next morning the plaque listing honorary lecturers in the school's main hall had been taken down. No announcement. And then, in a short interview replayed on local TV, when asked, "If she were your mother, would you still have done it?" he didn't answer immediately. That question, simple yet ruthless, stripped away all legal logic and justification. He swallowed hard, eyes lifting as if pleading for rescue, but no one spoke. At last, he exhaled, long, tired, and said only, "I think." At the time, I didn't see her as a human being. No one repeated that answer, but those who rewatched the clip in silence knew this was not remorse. It was unraveling, not because he'd committed a crime, but because he was no longer worthy of holding the law. Here is the complete and detailed American English translation of your text. Every number has been spelled out in full, with no content omitted, altered, or added. The structure follows the original flow as a continuous and cohesive narrative without unnecessary line breaks or bullet points. 1 week later, the sheriff's office received an order to re-examine all case files bearing Delroy's signature. Many cases were reopened. Several former victims were invited to meet again with the prosecution, but no one summoned Marlene to testify because no one dared to ask justice to return to a place that had once rejected it. That night, in front of City Hall, a group of final-year law students organized a public reading of excerpts from Delroy's falsified reports throughout his tenure. Each student held a page, read in their own voice, without protests, without chants. They simply read, and ended each segment with the same line. This is not a systemic error. This is an individual the system fed for too long. The reading lasted 6 consecutive hours. Under the light of phone screens and the cold stares of officials exiting the building. Hurrying as if escaping an indictment, no one had to sign. The next morning, at the public library on the city's east side, where an entire section once showcased the biographies of law enforcement figures, the plaque bearing Delroy's name had been taken down. No announcement, no declaration of erasure. In its place was a black and white photo of Marlene standing on her front porch. Beneath it, a small caption read, "Sometimes, to teach justice a lesson, you only need to live long enough for it to feel ashamed." Visitors captured the moment, and within 24 hours, the phrase, "shame is real," became the most searched keyword in the region. As Delroy tried to return to a normal life, a silent string of rejections followed him like a shadow. A community college where he applied to teach law enforcement skills sent an internal email to the faculty with a brief note, "We do not allow the past to enter classrooms," as if it never went wrong. A week later, his job application for a private security firm was rejected without interview. The HR manager hand-wrote on the form, "We do not hire those who made society rewrite the definition of trust." A staff member photographed the form and shared it online with the caption, "The one thing you can't protect is a documented lie." He disappeared from the media. No one defended him in print. No one posted his image as a misunderstood figure. He did not become a media symbol, because in this world, some people are not cast out for being exposed, but for being revealed just when history needs to cleanse itself. One afternoon, at the cafe he used to visit every Friday morning, his usual seat was still there, but an under repair sign had been placed on it for several weeks. The staff didn't have to turn him away. They didn't have to refuse him. There simply was no seat. A young customer, seeing him hesitate at the entrance, quietly stood, pulled the curtain closed, and said, loud enough for those inside to hear, "This cafe no longer has light for someone who once blinded others." Marlene did not attend the hearing. She didn't need to show up for the system to feel shame. But after that day, her front gate remained slightly open, not to welcome anyone, but to let the wind carry away something already dead. And within the withdrawn internal files, no one argued, because sometimes no trial is needed. Only one person standing still, long enough for the system to be forced to look back at itself. 2 days later, on the old brick wall opposite Central Police Headquarters, a new message appeared, not a banner, not a slogan, no organizational logo, just a line of graffiti sprayed in white paint over the weathered red wall, the letters bleeding slightly as if written by bare hands. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe your mother that apology a long time ago." No one stepped forward to claim the act. The security camera strangely malfunctioned at just that moment. Some said they saw a teenager in a black hoodie at dawn. Others believed it was a girl on a bicycle, but no one confirmed. And even stranger, no one really wanted to know. That morning, when the local newspaper reported on the graffiti with the headline "Another Emotional Overreach Against the System," the newsroom received nearly 500 emails in under 6 hours. Among them, one letter stood out so sharply that the editor-in-chief printed it in full on the front page. "This isn't emotion. This is memory unacknowledged, and I'm glad that wall still has room to be written on. Attached was a scanned death certificate of a single mother who had died from domestic violence after her husband, a police officer, was acquitted. Public opinion flipped overnight. That afternoon, as an order for removal was issued, a group of strangers gathered near the wall. No protests, no chants. They stood, backs to the graffiti, wearing professional attire with name badges, doctors, teachers, engineers, taxi drivers, as if to say, everyone has a mother. A city officer approached to order them to disperse. But when his eyes met a sign reading, "My child asked why was her mother beaten and no one jailed," he froze. Minutes later, he quietly turned, unpinned his badge, slipped it into his pocket, and said nothing. By noon, the police department's media office held an emergency meeting to manage the situation. A media aide suggested removing the message overnight to prevent it from being photographed. But when a clip with the graffiti and the caption, "This is not a crime, this is a generational will," reached over 4 million views on TikTok in 24 hours, suppression became impossible. Among the thousands of comments, one line was shared the most. "I used to think my mother's story was an exception. Now I realize it was the system." That same evening, when the cleanup crew was dispatched, they stood before the wall for a long time. An unexpected moment unfolded. A middle-aged man, wearing a safety vest, holding a paint bucket, raised his brush, then let it fall. He sat on the curb, took out his phone, and called his daughter. Witnesses heard him choke through the line. "I'm sorry for never standing up for you. I never asked your mother what she needed after that night. All I knew was silence." He hung up. He didn't clean the wall. No one made him. No one dared. The team supervisor stepped forward to urge him, but paused when he saw the man's eyes. Not angry, just hollow. One crew member, father of a newly graduated officer, told his superior, "I'll scrub it when that sentence stops being true." The removal order was postponed, then forgotten, then deleted from the system, as if it had never existed. 1 week later, a 10-year-old girl stood in front of the wall, asking her mother to take a photo. She wore a white dress, small backpack, pigtails. In the post accompanying the image, the mother wrote, "Someday, my daughter will tell this story as a real-life fairy tale. No fairy godmother, no magic, just an old woman who never shouted, never demanded, never struck back, but made society rewrite how it views human being." That same morning, a middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap, whose face once appeared on news broadcasts with the caption, "Lieutenant Delroy, a hero of the front lines," was recognized by a crowd as he quietly exited a bakery. A young shopgirl pointed at him and asked bluntly, "Where were you when she was crying?" No one told her to say it. No one encouraged it. But the shop fell silent. He didn't answer. He hurried out. The door hadn't even closed when another customer remarked, "You can buy bread anywhere, but not everyone still deserves to eat in peace." That 19-second video was shared millions of times with a single caption, "No revenge needed, only memory without bias." That afternoon, another clip emerged from the hallway camera at City Hall, where a former security sector leader had once declared, "No one is at fault," showing him waiting for the elevator. When the doors opened, 2 young employees stepped out but did not move aside, forcing him to awkwardly squeeze past. The woman in the clip looked directly into the lens and softly said, "There is no room for those who have evaded their mistakes." No one scolded. No one laid a hand. Yet, the way people avoided his handshake, the silence that filled the hallway as he passed, led social media to label it the most polite yet most painful punishment in modern political history. In the evening, at a small corner bar frequented by former officers, a young man asked the bartender, "Does Delroy still come here?" The bartender didn't reply, merely poured a glass of whiskey and poured it straight onto the floor. Applause erupted from the back of the bar. No names needed mentioning, but clearly there was no longer a seat for someone who once considered silence as neutrality. A tweet describing the scene, accompanied by a blurred background photo of the graffiti wall, garnered over 200,000 shares. With a single message, sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom, just memory and self-respect. Since that graffiti appeared, something in the eyes of passers-by began to change, not abruptly, not noisily, but enough for people to notice. When seeing an elderly woman crossing the street, many stopped. When witnessing a person of color being stopped at a store, many stepped in to stand beside them. No one preached, no one live-streamed, just no longer turning away. No one remembers the name of the officer who once knelt on another's back. No one recalls the Delroy family name. No more angry hashtags are posted. But people still mention a sentence from an old woman in a hearing without a microphone. "You don't need to apologize to me." Because from then on, people realized some sentences don't need to be engraved into law, just written on a wall and remain. There are no more Marlenis. She didn't write a memoir, didn't establish a charity, wasn't immortalized in bronze. But her image, holding a bouquet on her porch, eyes looking straight at the young officer, remains in millions of memories as a lesson needing no frame. Dignity doesn't require a microphone. A black female writer once wrote, "When a person lives rightly, they don't leave behind arguments. They leave a void that makes others question what they lacked." That sentence years later was etched small at the base of the graffiti wall, in childlike scrawl. She didn't force anyone to change, but people changed because of her. And so, the story concludes, not with an ending, but with an echo, not with a victory, but with a silent shift of the world from within. Because in the end, the only thing that remains is a sentence that isn't erased. But before being carved into stone, it once made those who had oppressed her bow their heads, not out of remorse, but because there was nowhere left to lift them. Once, during an internal sector gathering, where former public servants met to reflect on the past and renew, a member suggested inviting Delroy to speak a few words about experiencing modern public opinion. The room held several hundred people, but when he stood up, the front rows simultaneously pushed their chairs back, creating a stark void. An elderly woman walked out, saying nothing. Just placed a notebook on the table titled, "What I Once Believed I Now Tear Apart." A week later, he went to buy books at a major city bookstore. The store manager, who had previously worked in the clerical sector, recognized him from his ID card. When he approached the checkout, the cashier looked up, paused for a few seconds, then said, "I'm sorry, our card reader doesn't recognize those who have lost their credentials." The voice was gentle, but the entire store fell silent. A customer behind him reached out to place the book back on the shelf. On TikTok, a security camera clip was shared, with the caption, "There are places that don't need to ban entry, just need to remember who once walked through." Even when trying to avoid society's gaze by applying for a job at a suburban private organization, silence still didn't grant him peace. One Monday morning, while he was instructing new employees on ethical conduct standards in administrative environments, a female voice rang out from the back of the room. "You once stopped a woman in a courthouse hallway and asked if she was qualified to sit there. Now, you're teaching me ethics?" All eyes turned to him. No one defended. No one intervened. The meeting ended early. The next morning, the company's internal email was leaked, containing a message from the board. "We have never hired someone carrying unresolved societal aftershocks." The climax came during a community forum, where civil organizations discussed rebuilding trust between police and citizens. A university student, young, thin, baby-faced, held the mic and asked the former sector representative, "In your opinion, why do people still turn away when they see a badge?" No one expected the representative that day to be Delroy. He opened his mouth, hesitated, but couldn't utter a word. A little girl sitting in the third row pointed at him and asked her mother, "Is that the man, the one who made the lady cry?" The mother didn't answer, but the entire auditorium stood up. No applause, no anger, just standing, as if to return all moral height to someone with nothing left to support themselves. And then, one early morning, people saw that engraved sentence become clearer under the new sunlight. Rain had washed away the grime, but couldn't erase the childlike handprints that once etched it into the brick. Not a bronze plaque, not a nameplate, no need for recognition, but anyone passing by slowed down, looked down, then fell silent. No one explained, no one interpreted. Just in a world where fame can be bought, power can be imposed, and microphones can be silenced, there remains a sentence, an old woman, and a gaze that renders all justifications meaningless noise. And so the story concludes, not with an ending, but with an echo, not with a victory, but with a silent shift of the world from within. Because in the end, the only thing that remains is a sentence that isn't erased. You've just heard a story without heroes, without miracles, without loudly read verdicts. Just an old woman standing still amidst the world's noise, causing everyone to slow down. Perhaps you've never met a Marlene in real life. Perhaps you've once remained silent in a moment when you should have spoken up. But precisely because of that, what you share, please leave a comment. It doesn't need to be correct, just genuine. Tell me about someone who once made you reflect on yourself, a moment when you saw something wrong and didn't turn away. A sentence, no need to be famous, but one you still remember to this day. We can't change the entire system overnight, but a true story, reaching the right place, can make someone start anew with different eyes. Press like if you find this video valuable. Click subscribe so we have more reasons to continue telling stories that warm hearts in a world often too cold. Share, not because we need to go viral, but because someone out there might need a simple sentence, "You are not alone." Thank you for listening, thank you for not scrolling past, and thank you for perhaps being part of the silent but real changes happening.